He is not your son, so stop trying to correct him. That is what my husband shouted in my face as he aggressively shoved my hand down in front of my entire family. I did not scream or cry. I simply smiled, an icy smile said fine, and walked away. The next morning, his son's luxury car, private school tuition, and unlimited allowance all vanished into thin air. Before I dive into exactly how I systematically dismantled my toxic husband's life, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you love seeing entitled people get exactly what they deserve. My name is Nicole, and I am 31 years old. I work as a financial risk manager for one of the largest investment firms in Chicago. My job requires pure logic. I calculate liabilities, spot bad investments, and cut losses before they can destroy a portfolio. It is highly analytical and completely ruthless when necessary. I just never thought I would have to apply those exact same corporate strategies to my own marriage. Greg is 35 years old. When we met, he played the part of a successful businessman perfectly. He wore custom-tailored suits, drove a sleek car, and knew exactly what to say. But after we got married, the reality of his situation became very clear. His boutique consulting firm was barely breaking even. I was the breadwinner of the household. I paid our mortgage. I funded our vacations. And most importantly, I financed the incredibly lavish lifestyle of his 17-year-old son, named Tyler. Tyler was the definition of a golden child. Greg spoiled him rotten, and since Greg did not have the funds to back up his parenting style, my bank accounts took the hit. Tyler walked around with a sense of extreme arrogance, swiping the supplementary black credit card I gave him as if he had earned it himself. I tolerated his disrespectful attitude for 2 years, trying to keep the peace and be a supportive stepmother. But everything has a breaking point. The breaking point happened on a Friday night. We were at a highly exclusive French restaurant downtown, celebrating my parents' 35th wedding anniversary. I had rented out the private dining room for the occasion. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, and the long table was draped in heavy white linen and sparkling silver. It was supposed to be a beautiful, elegant evening to honor the people who raised me. My sister Beth, who is 28 years old, had flown in specifically for the dinner. She was wearing a stunning vintage cream silk dress she had spent months tracking down. Everything was set for a perfect night except for Tyler. Tyler spent the entire evening slouched deep in his chair. He was aggressively tapping on his smartphone and sighing loudly whenever anyone tried to include him in the family conversation. He had his elbows spread wide, taking up entirely too much space and practically pushing Beth off her seat. When the main courses finally arrived, Beth gently tapped his shoulder. She politely asked if he could just shift a few inches to his right so the waiter could set down her plate. Tyler rolled his eyes and scoffed loudly. Instead of simply moving over, he deliberately swung his heavy boot out and violently kicked the solid oak table leg. The impact shook the entire table. My mother gasped in shock as a full, oversized glass of burgundy wine tipped over. The dark red liquid splashed directly onto Beth's lap, instantly soaking and ruining her beautiful cream silk dress. Beth jumped up immediately, tears springing to her eyes as the red wine dripped down her legs and onto the polished hardwood floor. I waited for Tyler to apologize. I expected him to be horrified by his own clumsy anger. Instead, he let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "You guys are so dramatic," he sneered, not even bothering to look up from his glowing phone screen. "Just buy a new one. It is not my fault you tasteless hicks do not know how to sit at a fancy table." The room went completely dead silent. The waiters froze in their tracks. My parents looked absolutely horrified by the blatant disrespect. I stood up my chair, scraping loudly against the floor. I looked directly at Tyler and commanded him to apologize to my sister right now. I was firm, using my absolute best no-nonsense boardroom voice. Before Tyler could even open his mouth to respond, Greg stood up so fast his chair almost toppled over backwards. He reached across the corner of the table and aggressively shoved my hand down. He pointed a finger directly in my face, his expression twisted in pure anger. "He is not your son!" Greg shouted, his voice echoing off the walls of the private dining room. "So stop trying to correct him. Know your place, Nicole." Time seemed to freeze in that dining room. I looked at the man I had married, the man who was supposed to be my partner. I looked at the spoiled teenager who was currently spending thousands of my hard-earned dollars every single month. I looked at my sister who was standing there humiliatingly dabbing at her ruined dress with a cloth napkin. I did not scream at Greg. I did not cry or throw a glass of water in his face. In that precise second, my financial risk management training kicked in completely. Greg and Tyler were no longer my family. They were massive liabilities. They were bad investments that were draining my resources and disrespecting my blood relatives. I looked Greg dead in the eye. I gave him a cold, calculated smile, and I said one single word. Fine. I calmly picked up my leather purse from the back of my chair. I walked out of the private room and went straight to the front desk. I instructed the host to split the bill, paying the exact amount only for my meals, my parents' meals, and my sister's meals. I signed the receipt, tipped the staff generously for their trouble, and walked out the front doors into the cool night air. I left Greg sitting there with a furious teenager and a massive, exorbitant dining bill he could not possibly afford on his own. The drive back to our sprawling suburban house was the most peaceful 20 minutes I had experienced in over 2 years. No loud rap music blasting from the passenger seat. No complaining from a grown man about how his consulting business just needed one more month to turn a profit. It was just me, the hum of the engine, and the crystal clear realization that I had been actively subsidizing my own disrespect. When I pulled into the driveway of the 5-bedroom home that my salary exclusively paid for, I noticed Tyler's ridiculous custom matte black Range Rover parked haphazardly, taking up 2 spaces. I just shook my head. Not for long. I walked through the front door and went straight down the hall to my home office. My office was my sanctuary, a minimalist space of glass steel and multiple monitors where I controlled millions of dollars in corporate funds every single day. As a 31-year-old financial risk manager, my daily professional life revolves around identifying toxic liabilities. When a corporate asset starts hemorrhaging money, showing zero return on investment, and threatening the stability of the entire portfolio, you do not coddle it. You do not send it to therapy. You liquidate it. You cut the financial cord cleanly, brutally, and without a single ounce of emotion. Tonight, Greg and his spoiled son were no longer my family. They were bad debt. And it was time to balance my ledger. I closed the heavy oak door of my office and locked it with a satisfying click. I sat down at my desk, the digital clock on the wall glowing exactly midnight, and booted up my encrypted work laptop. The glow of the screen illuminated the dark room as I logged into my primary wealth management portal. For 2 years, I had allowed these leeches to drain my resources under the guise of building a family. Greg had convinced me that investing in Tyler's lifestyle was an investment in his future. What a spectacular, devastating scam. First on the chopping block were the supplementary credit cards. I pulled up the transaction history for the black premium card I had issued in Tyler's name. A quick scroll revealed the sheer audacity of this teenager. $500 at a designer sneaker boutique, $200 at a high-end steakhouse for lunch with his friends, $80 on premium video game currency, all charged within the last 48 hours. I hovered my mouse over the account settings. With one satisfying click, I permanently deactivated the card. I flagged it as closed by the primary account holder. I did the exact same thing to Greg's Platinum card. He had recently charged a golf club membership and a custom-tailored suit to my account, claiming he needed to project an aura of success to land his non-existent consulting clients. I deactivated his card immediately, effectively freezing his ability to buy so much as a cup of coffee on my dime. The immediate digital death of their spending power sent a thrill of pure adrenaline straight through my chest. But canceling their pocket money was just the appetizer. I opened a new tab and navigated to the parent portal for Tyler's elite private academy. This was a school that catered to the children of politicians, CEOs, and legacy wealth. Tyler's grades were absolute garbage, hovering just above failing, but Greg had insisted that the networking opportunities were vital for the boy's future. Because Greg's business was functionally dead, I was the one paying the exorbitant $25,000 tuition every single semester. The auto-pay for the upcoming spring term was scheduled to process in exactly 3 days. I navigated to the billing section, deleted my routing numbers, and completely severed the payment profile. I wanted to be absolutely thorough. I knew Greg would try to talk his way into an extension if given the chance. I drafted a direct formal email to the school's bursar and the admissions office. I explicitly stated that as the sole financial sponsor, I was withdrawing all funding for Tyler immediately. I requested a prompt refund for any advance deposits made for the upcoming semester and made it crystal clear that I would not be responsible for a single remaining cent of his educational expenses. I hit send. Next was the matter of insurance. I logged into my auto insurance provider, covering a 17-year-old male driver on a luxury SUV in a major metropolitan area cost an astronomical monthly premium. I removed Tyler as an authorized driver on my policy effective immediately at 12:01 a.m. Letting a spoiled, reckless, and now completely uninsured teenager drive a vehicle legally tied to my name was a massive liability I was not willing to absorb for another second. Which brought me to my final and favorite task of the night: the Range Rover. When Tyler turned 16, Greg had relentlessly begged me to buy the boy a safe, reliable car. He promised he would pay the monthly installments from his business revenue. Of course, he never made a single payment. Because I am a professional risk manager, I never put Greg or Tyler's name on the title. I purchased the vehicle entirely in cash and registered it directly to my personal limited liability company for tax and asset protection purposes. It was my property, period. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed a 24-hour premium towing and repossession company that my firm occasionally used to recover corporate assets. The dispatcher answered on the second ring. I provided the vehicle identification number, the license plate, and my home address. I emailed them the LLC documentation proving absolute legal ownership and authorized an immediate covert repossession from my own driveway. I instructed them to dispatch a flatbed truck before dawn, hook up the Range Rover quietly, without triggering the alarm, and transport it directly to a secure storage lot across the city. The dispatcher confirmed a truck would be there by 5:30 a.m. I hung up the phone and closed my laptop. The systematic financial purge took less than 45 minutes, but it erased 2 years of relentless exploitation. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair and let out a long, deep breath. The house was completely silent. I walked over to the small wet bar in the corner of my office, uncorked a bottle of expensive full-bodied red wine, and poured myself a generous glass. It was a silent, private toast to my sister Beth, and to the red wine that Tyler had so foolishly spilled on her beautiful dress. I took a slow sip, savoring the rich, complex flavors, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. I left my office, walked to the master suite, locked the bedroom door behind me, and slipped into the cool, fresh sheets. I closed my eyes and drifted off into the most peaceful, uninterrupted sleep I had experienced in my entire adult life, knowing full well the absolute devastation that awaited them at sunrise. At precisely 6 o'clock the next morning, my eyes opened naturally. I walked downstairs to the kitchen, the cool hardwood floors beneath my feet, a sharp contrast to the warm, rich aroma of the espresso machine completing its morning cycle. The house was completely silent, a temporary peace that I knew was about to be spectacularly shattered. I poured the dark, bitter liquid into a small ceramic cup, leaned against the marble island, and waited. The heavy, unmistakable rumble of a diesel engine broke the quiet of our upscale neighborhood. Amber strobe lights flashed through the sheer kitchen curtains, casting rhythmic shadows across the walls. Then came the sound that officially signaled the beginning of the end. "Hey, get away from that! What are you doing? Put that down." Tyler's voice cracked an octave higher than usual, laced with pure, unadulterated panic. I picked up my espresso cup and strolled casually toward the front door. By the time I reached the foyer, Greg was already bolting down the mahogany staircase. His silk bathrobe flapped wildly behind him, his face a portrait of utter confusion. He threw open the front door and sprinted barefoot onto the frost-covered driveway. I stepped out onto the porch, the crisp morning air chilling my skin, and took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. The scene unfolding in front of me was a masterpiece of risk management executed to perfection. A massive industrial flatbed tow truck was backed directly up to Tyler's prized matte black Range Rover. The driver, a towering man in a high-visibility vest, was already tightening the heavy steel winch chains around the vehicle's front axle. Tyler was pacing frantically in his pajamas, pulling at his hair, his face red with a mixture of rage and terror. He looked completely unhinged. "Dad, do something," Tyler shrieked, pointing at the truck. "This guy is stealing my car." Greg marched right up to the tow truck driver, puffing out his chest in a desperate attempt to look authoritative while wearing a bathrobe and slippers. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" Greg demanded, his voice echoing down the street. "Drop that vehicle right now before I call the police. You are trespassing on private property." The driver did not even flinch. He finished securing the heavy metal hooks, wiped his hands on his pants, and pulled a clipboard from his jacket. "I am executing a lawful repossession order authorized by the legal owner of the vehicle," the driver stated calmly. He checked the paperwork. "An LLC registered to this address. The owner confirmed the order 30 minutes ago." Greg spun around, his eyes locking onto me, standing peacefully on the porch. "Nicole, what is going on? Tell him to put the car down right now. Have you lost your mind?" I walked slowly down the porch steps, ensuring every word I spoke was crystal clear. "I have not lost my mind, Greg. I simply gained absolute clarity. You made it perfectly clear last night in front of my entire family." I looked directly at Tyler, who was staring at me with his mouth hanging open. "He is not my son. Therefore, I have zero legal, financial, or moral obligation to provide a teenager with an $80,000 luxury SUV. I am simply following your instructions. I am no longer trying to correct him. I am just cutting my losses." Greg's face turned a violent shade of purple. He turned back to the driver in a sheer panic. He knew without that car, Tyler's entire social identity would crumble, and Greg would have to deal with the fallout. "Look, this is just a domestic misunderstanding," Greg lied smoothly, trying to deploy his salesman charm. "Whatever the release fee is, I will pay it right now. Just unhook the car." Greg snatched his leather wallet from his bathrobe pocket and confidently pulled out the platinum premium credit card I had issued him. He shoved the card toward the driver. The driver pulled a mobile card reader from his belt, swiped the heavy metal card, and waited. A sharp negative beep pierced the morning air. "Declined, buddy," the driver said, handing the card back. "That is impossible," Greg snapped, his voice rising in panic. "Try it again. Run it manually." The driver punched the numbers in. Another loud negative beep. Tyler, who was watching his entire world slip away, grabbed his own black supplementary card and shoved it at the man. "Use mine! Use mine!" Tyler yelled. The driver swiped Tyler's card. A third negative beep echoed across the driveway. "Denied." "The account is closed," the driver said, his patience completely exhausted. He turned his back on them and climbed into the cab of the truck. By this point, the commotion had drawn an audience. Several neighbors, holding their morning coffees and fetching their daily newspapers, had stopped dead in their tracks. They stood on their manicured lawns, openly staring as the neighborhood's most arrogant teenager and his father failed to pay a tow truck driver. The humiliation radiating off Greg was palpable. He looked around at the watching neighbors, his carefully crafted illusion of wealth and success evaporating right in front of their eyes. The heavy hydraulic lift whined loudly. The Range Rover was hoisted onto the flatbed. The diesel engine roared to life, and the truck pulled out of the driveway, carrying Tyler's prized possession down the street and out of sight. Tyler literally collapsed onto the cold concrete of the driveway, burying his face in his hands, whining about how he was supposed to get to his elite private school without his car. Greg stormed past me, marching furiously back into the house. I followed him inside, closing the heavy front door behind us, shutting out the stares of the neighbors. Greg was breathing heavily, the veins in his neck bulging. He pointed that same aggressive finger at me the exact same way he had at the restaurant. "You think this is a game?" Greg shouted, his voice shaking with pure malice. "You think you can just cut us off and humiliate us in front of the entire neighborhood? You have pushed me too far, Nicole. I am going to log into the banking portal right now and transfer every single cent out of our joint savings account. Let us see how smug you look when I drain our funds to zero and leave you with nothing." I walked back into the kitchen, picked up my espresso, and leaned against the marble counter. I took another sip, savoring the rich flavor, and offered him a genuine, chilling smile. "Go ahead, Greg. Try it. He pulled out his phone, his fingers tapping aggressively on the glass screen as he loaded the banking application. I watched his eyes scan the screen. I watched his brows furrow in confusion. I watched the aggressive posture completely drain from his body as the reality of his situation finally hit him. There is no joint savings account, Greg. There never was. I explained, keeping my tone perfectly clinical and detached. Every single asset I brought into this marriage, every bonus I ever earned, and every property I ever purchased has been legally insulated in a blind trust since day one. I am a financial risk manager. Did you honestly believe I would leave my capital exposed to a man whose own business has not turned a profit in 3 years? Greg stared at his phone screen, looking at an account balance that reflected nothing but his own absolute failure. You never had access to my wealth, I continued softly. You only had access to my generosity. And last night you killed that completely. I left Greg standing frozen in the kitchen, completely paralyzed by the reality of his own financial impotence. I picked up my leather briefcase, walked out the front door, and drove my sports car to my downtown corporate office. By 7:30 in the morning, Tyler was forced to do the unthinkable. Stripped of his $80,000 luxury vehicle, he had to navigate the public transit system. For a spoiled teenager who had never known a life without heated leather seats and premium sound systems, taking the city bus was the ultimate indignity. I knew exactly how his morning commute played out because my phone was flooded with his unhinged voicemails by 8 o'clock. His voice echoed through my office speakers, complaining bitterly about the smell of the transit system, the absolute humiliation of standing at a bus stop in the freezing cold, and the sheer horror of sitting next to regular working-class people. He spent 3 full minutes plotting his revenge, threatening to make my life a living hell the second he got home. I just deleted the messages one by one, filing them away as irrelevant noise. At exactly 8:45, my secure desk line rang. The caller ID displayed the prestigious private academy. I answered on the first ring. It was the headmaster calling to formally confirm the receipt of my midnight email and the successful reversal of the $25,000 tuition payment. I kept my tone perfectly professional as the headmaster explained their strict protocol. Because I was the sole financial sponsor on file, and the funds had been officially retracted, the school had no choice but to take immediate action. Halfway through his first period advanced placement history class, Tyler was pulled out by the administration. I could picture the exact look of confusion on his face as the school security guard escorted him down the polished corridors to the admissions office. The headmaster informed Tyler that his enrollment was suspended effectively immediately. Until the massive balance was paid in full, he was completely barred from attending any classes, accessing the campus grounds, or participating in any extracurricular activities. This meant his prized position as the star player on the varsity lacrosse team was instantly revoked. His entire social standing, built entirely on my dime, evaporated in a 5-minute administrative meeting. Tyler did not take the news with quiet dignity. About an hour later, a link popped up in my messages from an old colleague whose daughter attended the same academy. The text simply read, "You might want to see this." I clicked the link, opening a video that was already spreading like wildfire across local social media networks. Tyler was throwing a massive, entirely unhinged tantrum right in the middle of the school's grand marble hallway. He was screaming at the top of his lungs, his face flushed red with rage, demanding that they let him back into his classroom. He aggressively kicked a heavy brass trash receptacle, sending it crashing into a row of mahogany lockers. Dozens of wealthy, status-obsessed teenagers had their phones out, recording every single second of his meltdown. The boy who had spent years acting untouchable and looking down on everyone else was now the laughingstock of the entire student body. His carefully curated image of immense wealth and power was shattered into a million pieces in a 3-minute high-definition video. The footage ended with campus security physically marching Tyler out the heavy front doors and leaving him standing on the public sidewalk. Completely humiliated and locked out of his elite bubble, Tyler frantically called his father. I did not have to guess what Greg did next, because my professional credit monitoring software immediately started pinging my phone with alerts. Greg was in full panic mode. Desperate to save his son from social ruin and quiet the storm, he logged onto his computer to secure a quick personal loan. He assumed he could just fill out a few online forms and borrow $25,000 to cover the tuition gap. But I am a financial risk manager, and I know exactly how banking algorithms work. For years, Greg had enjoyed the halo effect of my immaculate credit history, my massive income, and my substantial assets. Without my name attached to his applications, Greg was nothing but a financial ghost. The automated loan systems ran hard inquiries on his social security number. The results were disastrous. His boutique consulting firm showed zero legitimate revenue. His personal debt-to-income ratio was entirely upside down. Without my blind trust propping up his profile, his actual credit score was abysmal. The alerts on my phone chimed one after another as bank after bank hit him with instant rejections. Denied. 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 He could not secure a loan for $25, let alone $25,000. My personal cell phone rang. It was Greg. I let it ring 4 times before answering. His voice was a pathetic mixture of breathless rage and absolute desperation. He demanded that I call the school, fix the payment, and stop humiliating his son. I listened to him hyperventilate, leaning back in my office chair and looking out over the city skyline. I kept my voice perfectly level, completely devoid of any empathy. I reminded him that I do not finance bad investments, and I certainly do not bail out strangers. I hung up the phone, knowing that his complete financial impotence was about to drive him into making an even bigger mistake. I spent the remainder of my workday functioning with absolute laser focus. Without the constant draining distraction of Greg's financial demands and Tyler's manufactured crises hanging over my head, my mind felt sharper than it had in months. Returning to my sprawling suburban house that evening felt entirely different. For the first time since I foolishly allowed them to move in, the space actually felt like a sanctuary. There was no blaring television, no discarded sports equipment littering the hallway, and no entitled teenager demanding to know what I had purchased for dinner. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water, turned on some soft jazz, and began preparing a simple meal, fully intending to enjoy the profound, beautiful silence. That silence was violently shattered just past 7 o'clock. Heavy, aggressive pounding echoed from the heavy oak front door, accompanied by the frantic, continuous ringing of the doorbell. I did not rush. I placed my glass on the granite counter, pulled up the security camera feed on my smartphone, and observed the chaotic scene unfolding on my front porch. Greg was standing there looking panicked and pathetic in a wrinkled suit. But he had not come alone. He had brought reinforcements. Flanking him on the left was his 32-year-old sister, Angela, a woman who had spent her entire adult life riding the coattails of anyone willing to fund her lifestyle. On his right stood Angela's husband, Jamal. Jamal was a 34-year-old black man who worked as a regional human resources director for a mid-sized tech firm. He was wearing a sharply tailored suit and standing with his chest puffed out, carrying himself with an overwhelming, almost suffocating sense of unearned authority. I unlocked the front door and pulled it open. Before I could even offer a greeting, the 3 of them pushed their way past me, completely invading my personal space. Greg immediately scurried to the back of the group, cowardly, using his sister and brother-in-law as human shields. Angela crossed her arms, staring at me with a look of intense, smug satisfaction, clearly believing that her husband was about to put me in my place. Jamal marched straight into the center of my living room. He did not ask to sit down. He deliberately positioned himself to tower over me, utilizing a classic corporate intimidation tactic designed to establish immediate dominance. He adjusted his expensive watch, cleared his throat, and looked at me as if I were a problematic employee who had just been called into his office for a severe disciplinary hearing. "Nicole, we need to have a very serious dialogue regarding the toxic power dynamics you are enforcing in this household," Jamal began, his voice booming with rehearsed professional outrage. I stood near the entryway, my hands folded neatly in front of me, and simply watched him. I did not offer a rebuttal. I let him speak, fascinated by the sheer audacity of a man coming into a house he did not pay for to lecture the woman who owned it. "What you did this morning was not just an overreaction, it was systemically cruel." Jamal continued, pacing slowly across my Persian rug. He began weaving together corporate human resources vernacular with intense moral grandstanding, attempting to completely manipulate the narrative. "You are weaponizing your financial privilege to punish a vulnerable minor. You stripped a 17-year-old boy of his transportation, publicly humiliated him, and abruptly severed his educational opportunities. In my line of work, we have a very specific term for this kind of behavior. It is called financial abuse. I had to suppress the urge to laugh. Calling Tyler a vulnerable minor was the most absurd statement I had heard all year. Tyler was a deeply privileged, wildly entitled teenager who had spent the last 2 years treating me like a walking ATM. But Jamal was on a roll, deeply intoxicated by the sound of his own voice. Angela chimed in from the sidelines, her voice dripping with fake concern. How could you leave a child stranded like that? Greg has been beside himself all day. You are destroying this family over a spilled glass of wine. It was never just about the wine, and they all knew it. But Jamal quickly raised a hand to silence his wife, wanting to maintain absolute control of the room. He stepped closer to me, his tone shifting from a lecture to a direct, calculated threat. You need to understand the optics of this situation, Nicole, Jamal warned, narrowing his eyes. You hold a highly visible position at a major investment firm, a firm that prides itself on corporate social responsibility and ethical leadership. I have spent a decade building a vast network of executive connections across this city. I know people who sit on your corporate board. He let that statement hang in the air, allowing the weight of his implied influence to settle over the room. Greg finally peeked out from behind Angela, a nasty, victorious smirk forming on his face. He actually believed Jamal had me backed into a corner. If you do not rectify this situation immediately, Jamal threatened, his voice dropping to a menacingly low register, I will leverage every single professional connection I have to launch a comprehensive smear campaign against you. I will personally ensure that your board of directors is made fully aware that their star risk manager is an elitist abuser who systematically inflicts psychological and financial trauma on her Black extended family members and her defenseless stepson. I will frame this narrative so perfectly that your firm will have no choice but to terminate your employment to protect their public image. The room grew incredibly tense. Jamal delivered his final non-negotiable ultimatum. You are going to restore the tuition funding by tomorrow morning. You are going to retrieve that vehicle from the impound lot. You are going to reactivate the credit cards, and you are going to sit down and offer a formal, unreserved apology to Greg for the emotional distress you have caused today. If you fail to meet these actionable deliverables, your career will be entirely over by the end of the week. They stood there in my living room, a unified front of entitlement and manipulation, waiting for me to crumble under the weight of their extortion. Jamal looked incredibly proud of himself, thoroughly convinced that his aggressive corporate posturing had successfully terrified me into submission. He thought he was the smartest person in the room. He thought he had outmaneuvered a woman whose entire career was built on dismantling hostile threats. I looked at Greg's pathetic, hopeful face. I looked at Angela's arrogant sneer. And finally, I looked directly into Jamal's triumphant eyes. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I simply nodded slowly, acknowledging the full scope of their malicious plan. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of financial ruin and corporate sabotage. They had no idea that I had already rewritten the rules, and I was about to wipe them entirely off the board. I stood perfectly still as Jamal's threats echoed off the high ceilings of my living room. He genuinely believed he had backed me into a corner. He thought his corporate buzzwords and aggressive posturing would intimidate me into submitting to his extortion. I let the heavy silence stretch for a few seconds, allowing him to bask in his false sense of victory. Greg wore a pathetic, triumphant smirk, hiding behind his sister and brother-in-law like a coward. Angela looked at me with pure disdain, expecting me to break down and beg for forgiveness. I did not apologize. I did not raise my voice. As a financial risk manager, I do not react to emotional outbursts or empty threats. I deal strictly in verifiable data. I walked slowly over to the sleek glass coffee table in the center of the room and picked up a thick manila folder I had prepared specifically for this occasion. I untied the string closure and let a massive stack of banking documents slide out onto the glass surface. Bright yellow highlighter marked dozens of specific transactions across hundreds of closely printed pages. I looked directly at Jamal, matching his aggressive posture with absolute ice-cold composure. I told him that before he decided to launch a smear campaign against my professional reputation, he might want to review his own financial footprint. I watched his confident smirk falter just a fraction. I explained that when I began my financial purge at midnight, I did not just stop at Tyler's tuition and Greg's platinum card. I conducted a comprehensive forensic audit of every single account tied to my primary credit line. I pointed to the highlighted documents on the table. I revealed that I had uncovered a shadow allowance that had been quietly bleeding my resources dry for 2 solid years. Greg had a corporate credit card linked to his consulting firm. Because his business was functionally dead and generating zero revenue, that corporate account was directly guaranteed by my personal wealth management portfolio. I told the room that I had traced the entire transaction history of that specific corporate card. I read the charges out loud, my voice ringing with brutal clarity. A $7,000 luxury couple's retreat to Cabo San Lucas. $3,000 spent at a high-end designer handbag boutique downtown. Countless charges for 5-star dinners, premium spa days, and exclusive golf club access. None of these charges were made by Greg. Every single one of them had been authorized and signed for by Angela and Jamal. Angela visibly recoiled, the color draining completely from her face. She took a step back, suddenly trying to put distance between herself and the damning evidence spread across the table. Jamal's chest deflated. The imposing, authoritative human resources director persona evaporated in an instant, replaced by the wide-eyed panic of a man who had just been caught stealing. I did not stop there. I took a step closer to Jamal, invading his space just as he had invaded mine. I informed him that I had not just uncovered their little scam. I had already taken definitive action. I announced that I had officially severed the corporate card from my credit line early this morning. I had frozen the account entirely. But more importantly, because those expenses were strictly personal and falsely billed to a corporate entity subsidized by my assets, I had officially flagged every single one of those luxury charges as fraudulent. I watched the realization hit Jamal like a physical blow. I explained that my wealth management bank takes corporate fraud very seriously. By initiating a formal fraud investigation, the bank would be legally required to report the unauthorized siphoning of funds to the authorities. I looked Jamal dead in the eye and asked him how his pristine corporate reputation and his vast network of executive connections would handle a federal investigation into credit card fraud and embezzlement. Jamal started stammering, his smooth corporate vocabulary completely abandoning him. He tried to claim it was a misunderstanding, that Greg had authorized the expenses as a gift, but his voice was shaking uncontrollably. I reminded him that Greg had no authority to gift money that did not belong to him. I told Jamal that if he even thought about breathing my name to my board of directors, I would personally hand-deliver this manila folder to the chief executive officer of his tech firm and the local police department. Survival instinct kicked in immediately for the enablers. Jamal grabbed Angela by the arm, his grip desperate and tight. He did not say another word to me. He did not look at Greg to offer any further support. He just pulled his wife toward the front door, practically sprinting to get out of my house before the situation could escalate any further into criminal territory. Angela stumbled behind him, her previous arrogance entirely replaced by sheer terror. The heavy front door slammed shut, echoing through the foyer. The sudden departure left the living room suffocatingly quiet. The unified front of entitlement and manipulation was completely shattered in a matter of minutes. Greg was left standing all alone in the center of the Persian rug. His human shields had abandoned him the exact second their own comfortable lifestyles were threatened. He looked at the closed door in absolute disbelief, then slowly turned back to face me. There was nowhere left for him to hide. No fake consulting business to hide behind, no sister to defend him, and no brother-in-law to intimidate me. The illusion of his power was entirely stripped away. I stood by the coffee table, resting my hand on the stack of incriminating bank statements, and stared at the man I had married. He was cornered, utterly defenseless and completely at my mercy. Greg did not stay in my living room for long. Once the reality of his absolute defeat settled over him, the last remnants of his fake bravado vanished. He grabbed his coat, pushed past me without a single word, and drove off in his leased sedan to find the very people who had just abandoned him. I knew exactly where he was going. He was heading straight to Jamal and Angela to strategize. Jamal was a man who operated on manipulation and corporate spin. Faced with the very real threat of me exposing his credit card fraud to his tech firm, Jamal was terrified. But instead of advising Greg to apologize or accept his fate, Jamal convinced my husband that the best defense was a vicious, highly public offense. If they could not bully me in the privacy of my own home, they were going to try and destroy me in the public square. They decided to hit me with a coordinated two-pronged attack designed to force my rapid surrender. The first phase of their desperate strategy began the very next morning at the county family court filing office. Greg marched up to the clerk's window and officially filed a malicious petition for emergency spousal support. He did not just ask for standard separation terms. Prompted by Jamal's specific human resources terminology, Greg filed an injunction accusing me of severe financial abuse. He submitted sworn statements claiming that I had abruptly frozen all his assets, trapped him in a hostile living environment, and was actively attempting to starve him out of his own home. He painted himself as the devoted, struggling consultant who had been financially imprisoned by his wealthy, tyrannical wife. He demanded an immediate court order to restore his platinum credit cards, reinstate his monthly allowance, and force me to pay for his legal representation. He honestly believed that throwing the legal system at me would make me panic and cave to his demands. While Greg was busy playing the victim in a court of law, Tyler was executing the second phase of the attack in the court of public opinion. Stripped of his lacrosse team status and his luxury vehicle, Tyler decided to leverage the only currency he had left: internet sympathy. He retreated to his bedroom, set up his ring light, and recorded a highly edited, dramatically tearful video for TikTok and Instagram. He stared directly into the camera lens, forcing his eyes to look red and puffy, and launched into a performance worthy of a daytime soap opera. In the video, Tyler spun a tragic tale about his wicked stepmother. He claimed that I had maliciously stolen his car in the dead of night, leaving him stranded and terrified on the side of the road. He wept as he described how I had cruelly ripped him away from his beloved high school, right before graduation, destroying his chances of getting into a good college. He even went so far as to claim that I was locking the refrigerator and financially abusing his father, to the point where they could barely survive. He used all the right buzzwords, calling me a toxic narcissist who used wealth to crush a vulnerable teenager. He pleaded with his followers to share the video so the world could see the monster I truly was. The internet is a dangerous place for half-truths and fabricated victimhood. Tyler's video hit the local algorithms perfectly. Because he tagged our affluent suburban neighborhood and his elite private school, the post gained immediate explosive traction. Teenagers love a scandal, and a wealthy stepmother allegedly abusing a high school athlete was exactly the kind of drama that fuels viral outrage. Within 48 hours, the video had racked up tens of thousands of views across multiple platforms. It was shared in local community groups, whispered about in country club group chats, and debated by strangers who had never even met me. The digital mob mobilized quickly. My phone began lighting up with notifications as Tyler's online defenders found my professional profiles. They flooded my LinkedIn page and my investment firm's public directory with nasty, aggressive comments. Strangers demanded that my company fire me immediately. They called me an elitist abuser, a heartless corporate drone, and a disgrace to motherhood. They left one-star reviews on my firm's business page, claiming that a company employing such a cruel woman could not be trusted with clients' money. The sheer volume of the digital harassment was designed to be completely overwhelming. Greg watched the chaos unfold from the comfort of my living room couch. He felt utterly triumphant. He strutted around the house with a renewed sense of arrogance, believing he had successfully checkmated me. In his mind, he had created the perfect trap. He thought I would be so terrified of losing my prestigious corporate job and so ashamed by the public backlash that I would instantly restore their luxurious lifestyle just to make the nightmare stop. He actually smiled at me when we crossed paths in the hallway, looking like a man who had already won the war. He vastly underestimated who he was dealing with. A normal person might have cracked under the immense pressure of a legal injunction and a viral hate campaign. A normal person might have gone online to post a frantic defense video or begged a judge for mercy. But I am not a normal person. I am a professional risk manager. When a hostile entity attempts a hostile takeover, you do not negotiate with them. You do not plead with terrorists. You dig into their foundation and you find the structural flaw that will bring their entire operation crashing down. I ignored the hateful comments on my social media. I ignored the ridiculous summons from the family court. I walked into my home office, locked the door, and opened my encrypted laptop. If Greg wanted to open the door to extreme financial scrutiny by claiming abuse, I was more than happy to oblige him. I decided to stop looking at his surface-level spending and dive straight into the dark web of his financial history. I was going to find out exactly what kind of man was trying to destroy me, and I was going to unearth the hidden liabilities he was desperately trying to keep buried. The atmosphere at the investment firm was noticeably tense the moment I stepped off the private elevator. Usually, the morning rush in the downtown corporate office was a symphony of ringing phones, clicking keyboards, and low murmurs about market fluctuations. Today, however, the murmurs stopped completely as I walked past the glass-walled conference rooms. Analysts and junior executives quickly averted their eyes, pretending to be deeply engrossed in their monitors. I could feel the heavy, uncomfortable weight of their stares burning into my back. Tyler had executed his social media attack perfectly, and the digital mob had done exactly what Jamal designed them to do. The viral video had breached the heavily guarded walls of my professional life. I had barely placed my briefcase on my desk when my desk phone rang. It was the managing director requesting my immediate presence in his office. I smoothed my blazer, grabbed my notepad, and walked down the hall with my head held high. I knew exactly what this was about. When I entered his corner office, two other senior partners were already seated at the mahogany table. They looked concerned, tapping pens against their leather portfolios. The managing director did not waste time with small talk. He pulled up a tablet showing the flood of one-star reviews and vicious comments bombarding the firm's public directory. He asked me directly if the allegations of domestic financial abuse were going to become a liability for the company. A weaker person might have crumbled right there. A weaker person might have started crying desperately, trying to explain the nuances of dealing with a toxic stepson and a manipulative husband. I did neither. I sat up perfectly straight and looked my superiors dead in the eye. I informed them with absolute professional detachment that I was currently navigating a high-conflict divorce from a man who was attempting to extort me. I explained that the video was a fabricated retaliatory smear campaign orchestrated by his family to force a financial settlement. I assured the board that my legal counsel was already preparing injunctions and that my personal assets were completely insulated. I did not ask for their pity. I projected the exact same ruthless competence they paid me to execute every single day. My confidence disarmed them completely. The managing director nodded, satisfied with my risk assessment of my own life, and told me to keep them updated. I walked back to my office, closed the heavy glass door, and twisted the privacy lock. I lowered the electronic blinds, shutting out the rest of the corporate floor. Greg and Tyler thought public humiliation would make me surrender. They thought threatening my career would break my spirit. Instead, it just eliminated the very last shred of mercy I had left in my body. I sat down at my workstation and booted up my dedicated risk management terminal. This was not a standard consumer credit check. This was elite proprietary software designed to dissect corporate shell companies, uncover hidden offshore accounts, and track bad debt across the darkest corners of the global financial system. If Greg wanted to drag my name through the mud over a revoked luxury car and canceled tuition, I was going to use every tool at my disposal to burn his entire world to the ground. I entered Greg's full legal name, his social security number, and the tax identification number for his defunct consulting business into the system. I bypassed the standard banking institutions and directed the software to scrape the secondary and tertiary lending markets. I commanded the algorithm to dive into the murky waters of predatory lending, high-yield cash advances, and shadow financial networks. For 10 minutes, the screen flashed with lines of code as the system compiled the data. Then the alerts began to populate. The results were staggering. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, my eyes scanning the heavily encrypted financial footprint my husband had left behind. Greg had not just been relying on my bank accounts to fund his daily life. Over the past 12 months, he had been systematically securing a massive amount of hidden debt. I opened the first file, finding a $30,000 loan from a notorious online lending agency known for exploiting desperate business owners. I opened the second file, revealing another $50,000 cash advance from a completely different predatory firm. I kept scrolling, the numbers adding up to a terrifying total: $150,000. Greg had secretly taken out $150,000 in high-interest, short-term, incredibly toxic debt. The interest rates attached to these loans were astronomical, the kind of numbers that compound so aggressively they inevitably destroy lives and force bankruptcy. But the sheer amount of hidden debt was not the most horrifying discovery. As a financial professional, I knew that Greg's actual credit score was completely wrecked. He had no verifiable income. No legitimate lending institution would have ever approved him for a fraction of that amount based on his own merit. There was a missing link. I dug deeper into the digital archives, accessing the original PDF copies of the loan agreements. I pulled the documents up on my high-resolution monitor and scrolled straight down to the signature pages. My blood ran completely cold. Greg had not applied for these loans alone. He had listed a primary financial guarantor to secure the funds. He had used my name, my corporate title, and my impeccable credit history to back every single one of those predatory cash advances. I stared closely at the bottom of the screen. There, scrawled across the digital dotted line, was a flawless, meticulously traced forgery of my own signature. The breath hitched in my throat as the sheer magnitude of his betrayal washed over me. This was no longer just a messy domestic dispute about a spoiled teenager and a lazy husband. This was not just about unauthorized charges on a corporate card for luxury vacations. Greg had crossed a massive, irreversible line. He had actively committed felony identity theft and federal wire fraud. He had forged my signature to siphon $150,000 out of the shadow banking system, leaving me legally on the hook for his criminal actions. My hands stopped shaking. The initial shock evaporated, replaced by a pure, distilled, icy rage. Greg and Jamal thought they were playing a clever game of corporate extortion and social media manipulation. They had no idea that they had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them completely. I did not panic. I simply hit print on every single forged document, building a dossier of undeniable, federally prosecutable evidence. I did not stay in my corporate office a minute longer than necessary. Armed with the freshly printed stack of forged loan agreements, I slipped out of the building through the private executive garage. In the world of high finance, identifying a fraudulent loan is only the first step. To completely destroy the perpetrators, you have to follow the money and find out exactly where every single stolen dollar landed. I needed a specialist. I made a heavily encrypted call to an independent forensic accountant I had worked with on a massive corporate merger 3 years ago. His name was Brian. He was brilliant, ruthless, and most importantly, completely discreet. We agreed to meet away from the prying eyes of the downtown financial district. I drove my car to a secluded, dimly lit coffee shop tucked into the industrial edge of the city. Brian was already waiting at a corner booth nursing a black coffee. I slid into the leather booth across from him and handed over the thick manila envelope. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him my soon-to-be ex-husband had just taken out $150,000 in predatory loans, using my forged signature as the financial guarantor. I needed to know exactly where that capital was moved. Brian took one look at the exorbitant interest rates and the sloppy forged signatures and immediately understood the assignment. We left the coffee shop and walked 2 blocks to his private, secure office. His workspace was a fortress of humming servers and massive dual monitors. He booted up his proprietary tracing software, a program capable of unmasking hidden transactions across international and domestic banking networks. I stood behind his ergonomic chair, watching the screens intently as he manually entered the routing numbers from the predatory lending agencies. At first, the digital trail looked exactly like the chaotic, disorganized spending of a desperate man. The initial loan deposits hit a temporary holding account registered in Greg's name, but they did not stay there. Within 48 hours of each loan clearing, the funds were systematically drained. They were not spent on luxury cars, expensive golf clubs, or Tyler's ridiculous private school tuition. The money was chopped up into smaller, less conspicuous wire transfers. Brian's fingers flew across his keyboard, tracking the fragmented capital as it bounced through a maze of digital wallets and secondary payment processors. This was not the financial behavior of an incompetent, lazy husband. This was intentional, highly coordinated money laundering. After 45 minutes of intense digital excavation, Brian finally hit the bottom of the rabbit hole. All the fragmented wire transfers eventually converged and funneled directly into a single corporate checking account. Brian ran a rapid trace on the receiving account. It belonged to a phantom consulting firm registered as a limited liability company in the state of Delaware. Delaware is a notorious haven for shell companies because of its incredibly strict corporate secrecy laws. People use Delaware LLCs when they want to hide their assets and mask their true identities. But Brian was a master at his craft. He bypassed the standard public registries and dug into the secondary tax filings associated with the company's employment identification number. A fresh document populated on the right monitor. It was the official corporate registration detailing the primary beneficiary and the registered executive agent of the phantom consulting firm. I leaned in close to the glowing screen, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted paperwork. When I saw the name listed as the sole proprietor, all the air completely left my lungs. The name on the document was not Greg. The registered agent and primary beneficiary of the shell company was Jamal. I stared at the screen in absolute stunned silence. The pieces of the puzzle aggressively snapped into place. This was not just a case of a pathetic husband and a spoiled stepson bleeding my bank accounts dry. This was a highly organized systemic family scam. Jamal, the arrogant, self-righteous man who paraded around my living room acting like a moral authority, was the actual mastermind. He used his position as a corporate human resources director to project an aura of unshakable professionalism and ethical superiority. He used his corporate vocabulary and aggressive posturing to intimidate anyone who dared to question him. But underneath that tailored suit, he was nothing but a calculating con artist. Jamal had realized early on that Greg was weak, desperate to maintain a wealthy facade, and legally attached to a highly successful woman. Jamal manipulated Greg into taking out those massive high-interest loans. He convinced Greg to forge my signature to secure the capital. Then Jamal systematically siphoned that stolen money directly out of my financial ecosystem and funneled it straight into his own offshore shell company. Jamal was using Greg as a disposable pawn, and he was using Tyler's exorbitant teenage expenses as a convenient smokescreen to distract me from the massive financial hemorrhage happening right under my nose. He funded his luxury vacations, his expensive suits, and his arrogant lifestyle with money stolen directly in my name. I did not feel fear. I felt an overwhelming surge of predatory anticipation. Brian printed out the entire digital trail. He handed me a stack of undeniable, heavily corroborated financial documents tracing every single stolen dollar from the predatory lenders through the digital wallet straight into Jamal's hidden bank account. I took the papers and carefully placed them inside my leather briefcase. I now possessed the ultimate dossier of criminal fraud. I had the concrete evidence required to send both my husband and his manipulative brother-in-law to a federal penitentiary. I thanked Brian, paid his consulting fee in cash, and walked out of his office. I was perfectly armed and absolutely ready for the court-mandated mediation session. The downtown mediation center was designed to project an aura of calm neutrality, but the air inside the heavy glass conference room felt thick with hostility. I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in a sharp charcoal blazer, my hair pulled back into a severe no-nonsense style. I took my seat on one side of the massive polished oak table and placed my locked leather briefcase deliberately in front of me. I did not review any notes. I did not nervously check my phone. I simply sat in the quiet, sterile room, my mind operating with the cold precision of a predator waiting for its prey to walk into the trap. At precisely 10 o'clock, the heavy glass door swung open. Greg strolled into the room, exuding a level of unearned arrogance that was genuinely staggering. He wore a crisp suit and carried himself with the swagger of a man who believed he had just executed a flawless checkmate. But he was not alone. Flanking him was a man who practically radiated aggressive litigation. The lawyer wore a custom-tailored pinstripe suit, a heavy gold watch, and a predatory smile. He looked like the kind of legal mercenary who charged $1,000 an hour just to read an email. I knew instantly that Greg could never afford this caliber of legal representation on his own. Jamal was undoubtedly funding this high-priced attack dog using the very funds he had systematically siphoned from my credit lines. The absolute irony of Jamal paying a lawyer to threaten me with money stolen from my own financial ecosystem was almost poetic. A court-appointed mediator, a middle-aged woman with a soft voice and a thick binder, took her seat at the head of the table. She attempted to outline the ground rules for the session, explaining that our goal today was to reach an amicable temporary agreement regarding spousal support before facing a judge. She spoke about maintaining respectful dialogue and finding a middle ground. The aggressive lawyer did not even let her finish her opening statement. He cut the mediator off mid-sentence, slapping his expensive leather portfolio onto the table with a loud, deliberate thwack. He immediately seized control of the room, launching into a highly rehearsed, blistering offensive. He bypassed the mediator entirely and locked his dark eyes directly on me, attempting to use his physical presence and booming voice to intimidate me into submission. My client has been subjected to a campaign of severe, calculated financial and emotional abuse. The lawyer began, his tone dripping with righteous indignation. He paced behind Greg's chair, gesturing wildly as he spoke. He painted a picture of Greg as a devoted father and a supportive husband who had sacrificed his own entrepreneurial ambitions to support my demanding corporate career. According to this fabricated narrative, I was a tyrannical, elitist monster who had abruptly locked her family out in the cold without a shred of human decency. Greg leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at me with a sickeningly smug smirk. He honestly believed that the viral video Tyler posted, combined with the vicious internet mob attacking my professional profiles, had completely broken my spirit. He thought I was sitting at this table terrified of losing my job and desperate to make the public relations nightmare disappear. The lawyer reached into his portfolio and slid a thick printed document across the smooth oak table until it stopped right against my briefcase. He demanded that I review their proposed settlement agreement. He did not ask for a compromise. He issued a list of absolute extortionate demands. First, he commanded that I immediately draft a certified check to the elite private academy to fully reinstate Tyler's tuition and clear his suspended status by the end of the business day. Second, the repossession order on the luxury SUV was to be rescinded, and the vehicle had to be delivered back to my driveway in pristine condition by tomorrow morning. Then came the demand for Greg. The lawyer stated that his client was entitled to immediate emergency spousal support due to my sudden withdrawal of resources. He demanded a direct deposit of $10,000 a month. He called it lifestyle maintenance, insisting that Greg had a legal right to continue living in the affluent manner to which he had become accustomed during our marriage. The lawyer leaned heavily over the table, bringing his face closer to mine, his voice dropping into a harsh, menacing growl. He explicitly laid out the consequences if I refused to sign their extortionate document today. He promised a scorched earth legal battle that would make my current social media problems look like child's play. He threatened to drag my name through a highly publicized, incredibly messy divorce trial. He warned that he would subpoena the board of directors at my investment firm, leak damaging, fabricated narratives to local media outlets, and ultimately petition the court to seize half the equity in my 5-bedroom suburban house. He painted a vivid picture of my absolute professional ruin and total financial devastation. Through this entire blistering monologue, I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I did not offer a single word of protest or defense. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the cold leather of my briefcase. As a risk manager, I have sat across the table from hostile corporate raiders and panicked executives. I know that the loudest person in the room is always overcompensating for a structural weakness. I let the lawyer expend all his energy. I let him lay out every single threat, every ridiculous demand, and every fabricated claim of domestic abuse. I watched Greg nod along in agreement, his smug satisfaction growing with every aggressive word his expensive attorney weaponized against me. The lawyer finally finished his brutal offensive. He sat back down heavily in his chair, letting out a satisfied breath, clearly expecting me to panic. He slid a sleek silver pen across the table, tapping his finger on the signature line of the settlement document. The room plunged into a suffocating heavy silence. The mediator shifted very uncomfortably in her seat. She looked directly at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of pity and expectation. The entire room was waiting for my response. They expected my voice to shake. They expected me to start crying, to beg for a more reasonable number, or to hastily sign the paper just to protect my corporate career from further public destruction. I just looked at them, letting the dead silence stretch out for 10 excruciating seconds, savoring the very last moments of Greg's false reality before I opened my briefcase. I reached out and placed my hands on the solid brass clasps of my leather briefcase. The crisp, metallic click echoed loudly in the painfully quiet mediation room. I slowly withdrew a pristine, professionally bound document and slid it smoothly across the polished oak table until it bumped gently against the lawyer's aggressive settlement demand. I did not look at the lawyer. I looked directly at Greg. I asked him if he honestly believed a 31-year-old financial risk manager would enter into a legally binding marriage with a financially unstable man without a heavily vetted ironclad exit strategy. I watched Greg stare blankly at the cover page. It was a certified, fully executed copy of our prenuptial agreement. I explained in a voice completely devoid of any emotion that this contract explicitly waived his right to any spousal support alimony or lifestyle maintenance. It specifically outlined that the 5-bedroom house, purchased entirely with my capital, remained my sole and separate property under all circumstances. Greg had gleefully signed it years ago, completely blinded by the illusion of the wealthy lifestyle he was about to step into. Apparently, in his desperate scramble to extort me, he had entirely forgotten its existence. The expensive lawyer scoffed, attempting to recover his momentum and justify his exorbitant fee. He puffed out his chest and claimed that prenuptial agreements could easily be contested in family court, especially under severe claims of financial abuse and sudden domestic hardship. I let him finish his desperate, legally flimsy pivot. Then I reached back into my briefcase and pulled out the thick, heavily tabbed dossier provided by my forensic accountant. I dropped the massive stack of bank statements, loan agreements, and wire transfer logs squarely in the center of the table. I told the lawyer that before he decided to contest anything in a civil family court, he desperately needed to consult a criminal defense attorney. The arrogant smirk finally melted completely off the lawyer's face. I directed his attention to the bright yellow highlighted signature lines on the predatory loan applications. I explicitly laid out how Greg had forged my name to secure $150,000 in high-interest cash advances over the past 12 months. I watched the blood drain from Greg's face as I listed the exact dates, the specific loan amounts, and the names of the shadow lending institutions he had used. I did not stop there. I instructed the mediator, who was watching the scene unfold with wide-eyed shock, to turn to the final pages of the dossier. I detailed the systematic money laundering operation with clinical precision. I explained how the stolen funds were fragmented, bounced through secondary payment processors, and wired directly into a phantom consulting firm registered as a limited liability company in Delaware, a firm wholly owned and operated by Jamal Gregg's arrogant, manipulative brother-in-law. I turned my gaze entirely to the expensive attorney sitting across from me. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cold glass table, and invaded his professional space. I asked him how a man with zero verifiable income and a thoroughly destroyed credit score managed to afford his exorbitant hourly retainer. I watched the horrifying realization hit the lawyer like a physical strike. I calmly informed him that his hefty legal fees were currently being paid with funds obtained through felony identity theft and federal wire fraud. I suggested that by continuing to represent Greg, using stolen, laundered capital, he was inadvertently positioning himself as an accessory, after the fact, to a massive federal crime. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The aggressive, booming corporate litigator vanished into thin air. The man sitting across from me looked utterly terrified. He recognized the undeniable paper trail of a major financial felony staring him in the face. He knew the devastating ethical and legal implications for his own license and freedom if he touched another single dollar of Jamal's laundered money. Without saying a single word to his client, the lawyer frantically grabbed his expensive leather portfolio. He hastily shoved his legal pads, his silver pen, and his ridiculous settlement demands back into his bag. He stood up so quickly, his heavy chair slammed against the wall behind him. He looked directly at the mediator, his voice shaky but loud enough for the official record, and formally withdrew as counsel for the petitioner, effective immediately. He turned on his heel and practically sprinted out of the glass conference room, refusing to look back or offer Greg any explanation. The heavy glass door swung shut, sealing Greg inside his newly created nightmare. He was completely alone. His highly paid legal mercenary had abandoned him in under 2 minutes to save his own skin. The mediator sat in stunned silence, staring at the irrefutable evidence of a federal crime sitting in the middle of her pristine table. She closed her binder, realizing this was no longer a simple domestic dispute. Greg opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic, breathless stammering sound came out. His chest heaved as sheer panic fully consumed him. He looked at the prenuptial agreement that legally stripped him of his housing and his unearned lifestyle. He looked at the forensic audit that practically guaranteed him a lengthy prison sentence. The realization that he could no longer provide Tyler with luxury cars or elite private school tuition crashed over him. He was a complete failure, a fraud exposed in the harshest light possible. Every single piece of leverage he thought he possessed, every threat Jamal had carefully crafted for him, had been systematically dismantled and weaponized against him. I closed my leather briefcase, stood up, and looked down at the man who had confidently ordered me to know my place in front of my sister and my parents. The swaggering consultant was gone. In his place sat a terrified criminal waiting for the authorities. He was sweating profusely, his eyes darting around the room looking for a magical escape hatch that simply did not exist. I smoothed the lapels of my charcoal blazer, feeling the immense satisfaction of a perfectly executed risk liquidation. I was perfectly positioned, absolutely untouchable, and completely ready to watch his entire world collapse around him as desperation took its final hold. The walk from the mediation center to the parking garage was a blur of pure panic for Greg. His phone buzzed relentlessly in his pocket, lighting up with encrypted text messages from the shadow lenders. Predatory debt collectors do not send polite late notices, they send coordinates, photographs of front doors, and absolute deadlines. He had 72 hours to produce a massive installment on the $150,000 loan, and his primary source of stolen capital had just completely evaporated. Jamal was entirely out of the picture, aggressively distancing himself to protect his own shell company. Greg was financially stranded, legally exposed, and absolutely desperate. He called Tyler from the front seat of his leased sedan, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the steering wheel. He told the boy to pack a duffel bag and meet him at the house immediately. They needed untraceable liquidity, and they needed it before the banks closed. The midday sun beat down on the quiet suburban street as Greg's car rolled up to my property. The driveway was empty. My sports car was parked securely in the underground executive garage downtown. To Greg and Tyler, the silent house signaled a perfect opportunity. They assumed I had returned to my office to deal with the fallout of their pathetic social media smear campaign. They believed they had a clean, uninterrupted window to execute a deeply flawed, incredibly stupid contingency plan. Greg unlocked the front door, rushing inside with Tyler close behind. The house was bathed in natural light, completely still. They did not bother to take off their shoes. They marched straight up the mahogany staircase, leaving dirty footprints on the pristine cream carpets. Greg led his son directly into my master suite and straight toward the heavy reinforced door of my customized walk-in closet. At the back of the closet was a biometric safe room, a specialized vault where I kept my most liquid and highly appreciating physical assets. For years, I had curated a meticulous collection of vintage rare timepieces and heavy heirloom jewelry. Greg had always coveted that collection. He used to stare at the display cases with undisguised greed, completely unable to comprehend the discipline required to acquire such assets. Now driven by the absolute terror of his impending defaults, he saw those watches as his only lifeline. Greg had retrieved a heavy steel crowbar from his trunk. He jammed the wedge into the reinforced door frame of the closet. Sweat poured down his face, soaking the collar of his expensive dress shirt, as he threw his entire body weight against the metal bar. The wood splintered with a loud, violent crack. The locking mechanism buckled under the sheer force of his desperation. He kicked the door open, panting heavily, and stepped into the small, climate-controlled room. Tyler followed him inside, his eyes widening as he looked at the sleek velvet display boxes lining the shelves. The arrogance that had been stripped from him at the private school suddenly rushed back. He let out a harsh, excited laugh, completely thrilled by the illicit adrenaline of robbing his own stepmother. "Grab the Rolexes first," Greg ordered, his voice frantic and breathless. "Grab the Patex, the diamond tennis bracelets, all of it. Leave the empty boxes, we just need the hardware." Tyler unzipped a large black nylon backpack. He started snatching the heavy glittering watches right off their velvet display cushions. He tossed them carelessly into the bag, metal scratching against metal, completely disregarding the pristine condition of the assets. They moved with frantic, chaotic energy, clearing out hundreds of thousands of dollars in physical wealth in a matter of minutes. "We should smash the back patio door on the way out," Tyler suggested, zipping the heavy backpack shut with a satisfied smirk. "We will throw a rock through the glass, make it look like a street gang broke in while she was at work. She will just file an insurance claim and assume it was random." Greg nodded enthusiastically, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. "That is brilliant! She will be so tied up with the insurance adjusters in the divorce court she will not even look our way. Let us get out of here. We need to hit the Diamond District before 3 o'clock." They turned and practically sprinted out of the master suite, absolutely convinced they had just executed the perfect suburban heist. They honestly believed they were walking out of my house with the capital required to save their own skin. They were entirely unaware that I was watching every single second of their pathetic burglary in glorious high-definition 4K resolution. I was sitting comfortably at my desk in my downtown corporate office. My primary monitor displayed my daily risk assessment charts, but my secondary heavily encrypted screen showed a live, crystal-clear feed from the micro cameras I had meticulously installed in the ceiling corners of my safe room 3 days ago. As a financial risk manager, my entire career is built on anticipating the absolute worst aspects of human behavior. When I initiated the financial purge, I knew Greg would inevitably hit a wall of pure desperation. I knew that a man drowning in shadow debt would resort to theft to save himself. I did not just install cameras to watch them steal my property, I engineered a flawless, inescapable trap. Greg had instructed Tyler to leave the velvet display boxes behind, but he was too rushed and too ignorant to realize that the value was not just in the metal. I had carefully opened the plush velvet lining of every single watch compartment. I had slipped microscopic tracking tags deep inside the padded cushions that the watches were wrapped around and then seamlessly sealed them back up. In their blind haste, Tyler had tossed several of the padded cushions directly into the backpack, along with the jewelry, to keep the watches from shattering against each other. I watched the live video feed as they smashed the glass of my back patio door, a pathetic attempt to stage a random break-in. I took a slow sip of my coffee, perfectly calm. I opened a new tracking application on my laptop. A bright red digital dot pinged to life on the city map. It moved slowly down my suburban street, accelerating as Greg's leased sedan hit the main highway. They were carrying stolen felony assets, completely oblivious to the fact that they were broadcasting their exact location directly to my personal server. I picked up my cell phone, ready to make a very specific call to the local police precinct. I dialed the direct line to the local police precinct commander, a man whose community outreach programs my investment firm heavily sponsored every single fiscal year. I did not have to wait on hold. I provided the dispatcher with the live global positioning coordinates, a detailed itemized list of the stolen inventory, and the exact make, model, and license plate of the vehicle currently transporting my felony assets. The authorities were more than happy to coordinate an immediate targeted interception. The city streets blurred past Greg's leased sedan as he sped toward the downtown Diamond District. He drove erratically, fueled by the intoxicating adrenaline of what he falsely believed was a successful heist. He pulled up to an establishment situated on a gritty corner of the jewelry sector. The pawn shop boasted reinforced bulletproof glass windows and a discreet side entrance specifically designed for clients desperate to liquidate high-value assets without answering too many uncomfortable questions. Greg pushed through the heavy security doors, dragging Tyler along with him. The interior of the shop smelled of stale coffee and pure desperation. They marched straight up to the scratched glass display counter. Greg aggressively unzipped the black nylon backpack and dumped the glittering contents out. The vintage, immaculate timepieces cascaded onto the glass, hopelessly tangled in the soft, plush velvet cushions that Tyler had haphazardly scooped up during their frantic raid. The pawnbroker, a hardened man wearing a jeweler's loop and a deeply cynical expression, began inspecting the haul. He recognized the profound value of the pieces immediately. He saw the flawless craftsmanship of the assets, but he also smelled the overwhelming stench of panic radiating from Greg's sweat-soaked dress shirt. Knowing he had the upper hand, the pawnbroker offered a completely insulting fraction of the collection's actual market worth. Greg, suffocating under the crushing weight of his impending shadow debt defaults, accepted the terrible deal instantly without issuing a single counteroffer. The broker retreated to the heavy steel vault in the back room and returned carrying thick, tightly banded stacks of $100 bills. He dropped the cash directly onto the display counter. Greg reached out his trembling fingers, hovering just inches away from the money that he desperately believed would save him from the violent wrath of his predatory lenders. That is exactly when the heavy magnetic security door buzzed loudly and violently swung open. I walked into the pawn shop, my posture perfectly rigid and my expression carved from ice. Flanking me on either side were two large, uniformed, heavily armed police officers. The electronic bell above the entrance was still ringing as the suffocating, inescapable reality of the situation violently crashed down on my husband and his spoiled son. Greg completely froze in place, his hands suspended in midair over the stacks of cash. Tyler physically recoiled, backing away from the display counter as if the money had suddenly caught fire. I did not raise my voice or resort to dramatics. I took one calculated step forward, holding my smartphone up high for the officers to see. I tapped a single highly anticipated button on my screen. Instantly, a sharp, piercing, high-pitched chirping sound began echoing rapidly through the quiet pawn shop. The noise was coming directly from the velvet display cushions scattered across the glass counter, buried right next to the stolen watches. I looked at the officers and calmly stated that the items sitting on that counter were the stolen contents of my biometric safe, and the tracking application on my device proved my ownership definitively. Greg immediately shifted into his pathetic manufactured salesman persona. He threw his hands up in a desperate, placating gesture, plastering a fake, panicked smile across his sweating face. He tried to laugh the entire situation off, telling the officers that this was just a massive, ridiculous domestic misunderstanding. He claimed we were going through a messy divorce and that I was just being a vindictive, overly dramatic wife, trying to temporarily tie up marital assets. He loudly insisted that the watches belonged to him and that he had every legal right to liquidate them for cash. I simply handed the lead officer a digital folder containing the undeniable proof of purchase receipts, the registered serial numbers of every single watch, and the verified legal documentation showing the assets were exclusively registered to my personal wealth management company. Greg had absolutely zero legal claim to the property sitting on that counter. The officer scrutinized the paperwork, glanced down at the relentlessly chirping velvet cushions, and then looked directly at Greg with pure disgust. The officer unclipped the heavy metal handcuffs from his leather duty belt. The sharp metallic clink of the handcuffs being readied sent Tyler into an absolute spectacular meltdown. The arrogant teenager who had spent his entire morning throwing a destructive tantrum at his elite private school completely shattered into pieces. Faced with the terrifying, highly realistic prospect of being locked inside a state penitentiary, Tyler instantly turned on his father. Tyler started sobbing hysterically, pressing his back deeply into the corner of the shop. He pointed a trembling finger right at Greg's chest and began screaming at the top of his lungs. He wailed to the police that he had absolutely nothing to do with the robbery. He shrieked that Greg had forced him into the house against his will, that Greg had brought the heavy steel crowbar, and that Greg had violently smashed open the safe room door. He threw his own father under the bus without a single second of hesitation, desperately begging the officers to let him go because he was just a minor following orders. Greg stared at his golden child in absolute, unadulterated horror. The son he had spoiled rotten for years, the teenager he had blindly funded using my stolen money, had viciously betrayed him the very second his own personal freedom was threatened. The illusion of their unbreakable father and son bond evaporated right there on the dirty floor of the pawn shop. The police officers were completely unfazed by the pathetic domestic theater. They grabbed Greg by the arms, forcefully spun him around, and slammed him face first against the glass display counter. The heavy steel cuffs locked tightly around his wrists. A second officer grabbed a thrashing, crying Tyler and cuffed his hands securely behind his back, completely ignoring the teenager's frantic, pathetic pleas for mercy. I stood perfectly still, and watched as the officers marched my husband and my former stepson toward the exit. The pawnbroker quietly swept his stacks of cash back off the counter and retreated quickly into his safe room, wanting absolutely nothing to do with the federal felony unfolding in his lobby. The officers pushed open the heavy front doors and dragged Greg and Tyler out onto the busy downtown sidewalk. A massive crowd of pedestrians, shoppers, and local business owners had already gathered outside, drawn by the flashing lights of the police cruisers. Dozens of strangers stopped what they were doing and openly stared as the two men were paraded down the public street in handcuffs. Tyler kept his head down, sobbing uncontrollably, his face flushed red with profound, inescapable humiliation. Greg stumbled forward, his expensive suit completely rumpled, his manufactured dignity utterly stripped away. He tried to look back at me through the glass door of the pawn shop, his eyes wide with a pathetic mixture of terror and pleading desperation. I did not offer him a single shred of comfort. I simply turned my back, began carefully repacking my highly valuable assets into my leather briefcase, and let the police violently shove them both into the cramped back seat of the waiting squad car. I secured the brass clasps on my briefcase and followed the trailing police cruisers to the downtown precinct. The interior of the station was a stark contrast to the sterile, quiet environment of my corporate office. Neon lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh glare over the scuffed linoleum floors and the chaotic energy of a busy Saturday afternoon. I spent the first hour inside a cramped, windowless room, with a lead detective providing my official statement and transferring the digital evidence of the burglary to their encrypted servers. When I finally pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped out into the main bustling lobby, the absolute reality of the situation was on full display. Behind a thick wall of reinforced glass and heavy steel bars sat my husband and his golden child. Tyler was curled into a tight ball on a rigid metal bench, his face buried in his knees, his body shaking with aggressive, uncontrollable sobs. Greg was pacing the length of the small holding cell like a trapped animal, his expensive suit wrinkled and stained with sweat. The sheer panic radiating from his eyes was palpable. He kept looking toward the heavy double doors of the precinct lobby, desperately waiting for a miracle to walk through. That miracle arrived in the form of Jamal. The heavy glass doors swung open and my brother-in-law marched into the precinct. He wore a sharply tailored navy suit and carried himself with that same suffocating, unearned authority he had tried to weaponize in my living room just days ago. He bypassed the waiting area completely and strode directly up to the elevated desk of the duty sergeant. He did not ask for information. He demanded it. I stood quietly in the shadows near the detective corridor, gripping the police-issued iPad that contained my security footage. I watched Jamal lean heavily against the high counter. He immediately deployed his corporate human resources vernacular, attempting to completely manipulate the legal narrative. "My name is Jamal, and I am a regional HR director," he boomed, ensuring his voice carried across the entire lobby. "I am here to secure the immediate release of my family members. What your officers have done today is a gross, systemic overreach. You have violently arrested a black teenager and his father over a simple domestic property dispute. This is a private marital disagreement regarding shared assets, not a criminal matter. I am fully prepared to leverage my corporate legal network and contact the local Civil Rights Commission to expose this racially motivated harassment if they are not uncuffed and released into my custody right this second." The desk sergeant, a hardened veteran who looked like he had not slept in 3 days, slowly lowered his pen. He stared at Jamal with an expression of pure, unadulterated exhaustion. Before the sergeant could issue a verbal warning, I stepped out of the shadows and walked directly up to the front counter. I placed the iPad down on the scratched surface, turning the high-resolution screen so both the sergeant and Jamal had a perfect view. "There is no domestic dispute," I stated, my voice echoing with icy precision. "And there are certainly no shared assets. The man in that holding cell broke into my separate, legally protected property using a heavy steel crowbar." I tapped the play button on the screen. The crystal-clear 4K footage began to roll. Jamal's aggressive posture instantly stiffened as he watched the video. He saw Greg violently smashing the reinforced door frame of my biometric safe room. He watched Tyler eagerly stuffing hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of vintage timepieces and heirloom jewelry into a black nylon backpack. He heard the crystal-clear audio of the two men laughing about smashing a glass patio door to stage a fake neighborhood break-in. I looked directly into Jamal's widening eyes. I informed him that the men in that cell were not victims of systemic overreach. They were caught red-handed committing grand larceny, felony destruction of property, and trafficking stolen goods. The desk sergeant tapped his knuckles on the counter, his patience completely depleted. He pointed a thick, calloused finger directly at Jamal's chest. "You have exactly 10 seconds to step away from my desk," the sergeant warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly tone. "If you attempt to interfere with a felony investigation one more time, or if you come into my precinct throwing baseless accusations at my officers to protect a couple of thieves, I will personally throw you in a holding cell right next to them for obstructing justice. Do I make myself perfectly clear?" Jamal's imposing authoritative persona completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. The corporate bravado evaporated, leaving behind a terrified con artist who realized he was standing dangerously close to a massive legal fire. He knew he could not spin a high-definition video of a violent robbery. He did not say another word. He swallowed hard, took 3 rapid steps backward, and practically sprinted out of the precinct lobby, abandoning Greg to his fate without a single backward glance. I picked up the iPad and slowly walked over to the reinforced glass of the holding area. Greg stopped pacing the exact second he saw me approach. The color completely drained from his face as he realized his brother-in-law had just fled the building. The illusion that he could manipulate his way out of this nightmare was officially dead. Greg rushed to the steel bars, gripping the cold metal so tightly his knuckles turned stark white. The arrogant swagger of the man who had shoved my hand down at a fancy restaurant was entirely gone. His knees buckled under the crushing weight of his impending reality. He dropped straight down to the dirty linoleum floor, sinking to his knees right in front of me. Tears streamed down his face, cutting tracks through the sweat and grime. He began to sob, a pathetic, gut-wrenching sound that echoed off the concrete walls. He pressed his face against the steel bars, begging me for mercy. He pleaded with me to drop the charges, swearing he would do anything I wanted, promising he would sign any document, and frantically crying that he could not survive a stint in a state penitentiary. I stared down at the pathetic display unfolding through the heavy steel bars of the holding cell. Greg was hyperventilating, his expensive designer suit, ruined by the grime of the precinct floor tears, tracking through the dirt on his face. He offered me absolutely everything, promising to sign whatever document I wanted just to avoid a state prison sentence. I did not smile. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I simply turned to the lead detective standing nearby and requested a private room to discuss a potential domestic resolution before moving forward with the charges. The detective nodded and signaled for a uniformed officer to escort my husband to an interrogation room. I walked into the small, windowless space. A single fluorescent bulb buzzed loudly overhead, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on the scratched metal table bolted directly to the cold concrete floor. A minute later, the heavy door opened. An officer guided Greg inside, removing his handcuffs before stepping out and closing the door with a resounding metallic thud. Greg collapsed into the rigid metal chair across from me. He was trembling so violently that the table shook when he rested his arms against it. He looked up at me, his eyes completely hollowed out by absolute terror. I did not offer him a glass of water. I unclasped my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents I had instructed my attorney to draft days ago. I slid them across the cold metal surface. I told Greg that I was willing to officially decline pressing felony burglary charges against him and his son, but my mercy came with a massive, non-negotiable price tag. I laid out the terms with absolute clinical precision. First, he was going to sign a no-contest divorce decree. He was permanently waiving any and all rights to alimony, spousal support, lifestyle maintenance, and any future claim to my 5-bedroom home. I pulled out the second document and placed it right in front of his shaking hands. I explained that this was a legally binding affidavit acknowledging his sole and exclusive responsibility for the $150,000 in high-interest predatory loans. He was going to sign a sworn statement confessing that he had forged my signature as the guarantor and that he legally assumed the entirety of that toxic shadow debt. Finally, I told him that the precise second he was released from this precinct, he and Tyler had exactly 24 hours to pack whatever fit into their cheap suitcases and vacate my property forever. Greg stared at the staggering pile of paperwork. He opened his mouth, attempting to negotiate a fraction of mercy. He pleaded that taking on the predatory debt without my corporate income to shield him would completely bankrupt him within a month. I cut him off immediately. I leaned across the metal table and explicitly outlined his alternative. I told him that if he hesitated for even one single second, I would walk right out of this room and hand the district attorney the high-definition security footage of the robbery, the global positioning tracking data, and the forensic audit proving federal wire fraud. I promised him that he would spend the next decade in a state penitentiary and Tyler would be entering the criminal justice system long before his 18th birthday. The horrifying reality of his impending incarceration crushed whatever tiny shred of resistance he had left in his body. Greg practically lunged across the table to grab the cheap plastic pen resting near the documents. His hands shook so severely he could barely grip the plastic, but he frantically scribbled his signature on every single line. He initialed every single page, completely signing away his financial future to save his own skin. He pushed the executed documents back toward me, tears dripping from his chin onto the metal table, desperately begging me to tell the police to let him out. I calmly collected this paperwork, ensuring every signature was valid and legally binding. I placed the documents back into my briefcase and secured the brass clasps. I stood up, looked down at the ruined man sitting in the harsh fluorescent light, and told him his 24-hour eviction clock started right now. I walked out of the interrogation room, informed the desk sergeant that I was declining to press charges at this time, to pursue a civil resolution, and walked out of the precinct. Less than an hour later, Greg was processed out of the system. He stumbled through the heavy glass doors of the precinct and walked out into the cold, desolate parking lot. He had no luxury car, no money, and his entire comfortable life was effectively over. But as he wandered aimlessly toward the street, a dark sedan flashed its headlights from the far corner of the lot. Greg approached cautiously. The tinted window rolled down, revealing Jamal sitting in the driver's seat. Jamal had not completely fled the area. His arrogant, authoritative persona had been violently shattered by the desk sergeant, but his profound, vindictive rage had kept him lurking in the shadows outside. He unlocked the passenger door, ordering Greg to get inside. Greg collapsed into the leather seat, burying his face in his hands, crying that I had forced him to sign everything away and assume the massive criminal debt. Jamal gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning stark white. The humiliation of being silenced and threatened with arrest in front of a crowded lobby burned through his veins. Jamal refused to accept absolute defeat. He looked at Greg with pure, unadulterated malice. He told his brother-in-law that a signed divorce decree and an assumed debt meant absolutely nothing if I was entirely stripped of my corporate power. Jamal's mind raced with a dark retaliatory strategy. As a human resources director, he knew exactly how corporate compliance departments operated. He realized that if they could manufacture a catastrophic, highly credible scandal at my investment firm, they could trigger a massive internal investigation. Sitting in the dim light of the parking lot, the two humiliated, desperate men conspired to launch one final destructive attack. They decided to bypass the family court system entirely and aim a lethal strike directly at the very foundation of my career. They schemed to frame me for a massive financial crime, completely unaware that their dirty, desperate plan was exactly the catalyst I needed to trigger my ultimate contingency protocol. The 24-hour eviction clock was ticking down, but rather than packing his belongings, Greg chose to double down on his own destruction. Sitting in the dimly lit interior of Jamal's sedan in the precinct parking lot, the two men pooled their collective resentment and panic into a singular, malicious strategy. Jamal possessed a deep, intricate understanding of corporate compliance infrastructure. As a human resources director, he knew exactly what specific trigger words, regulatory red flags, and compliance violations would force a major investment firm, to bypass standard protocols and initiate an immediate, merciless internal audit. They spent the entire night drafting a highly sophisticated anonymous whistleblower report designed to completely obliterate my career. This was not a sloppy, emotional email. Jamal engineered it to look like a legitimate, highly documented leak from a high-level financial insider. The document accused me of severe systemic insider trading and the direct embezzlement of top-tier client funds. Jamal wove in complex financial jargon referencing my exact department, my specific software access levels, and my recent risk management decisions. He made the fabricated allegations sound so credible, so legally toxic, that no board of directors could afford to ignore them. At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, using a heavily encrypted burner email account set up on a newly purchased prepaid smartphone, Greg sent the malicious report directly to the chief executive officer and the entire board of directors at my firm. I was completely unaware of their desperate digital sabotage. At 9:30, I was standing at the head of the main corporate boardroom, presenting my quarterly risk mitigation forecasts to a room full of senior partners. The presentation was flawless. I was just clicking to the final revenue projection slide when the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. It was not an assistant bringing coffee. It was the head of global security, flanked by the chief compliance officer and the managing partner. The entire room fell into an uncomfortable, absolute silence. The managing partner did not wait for me to finish my sentence. He sternly requested that I step away from the projector and accompany them to the executive suite immediately. They escorted me down the long, carpeted hallway like a criminal. When we entered the executive suite, I was presented with the printed anonymous whistleblower report. The chief compliance officer informed me that due to the extreme severity of the allegations, specifically the claims of insider trading and embezzlement, my network access had already been completely revoked. I was officially suspended from my position as financial risk manager, effective immediately pending a massive third-party forensic investigation into my accounts. The managing partner looked at me with a mixture of profound disappointment and legal terror. He told me I needed to gather my personal belongings and vacate the premises immediately to ensure the strict integrity of the firm's data servers. A normal employee might have panicked, pleaded for their job, or desperately tried to explain that their soon-to-be ex-husband was launching a retaliatory strike to avoid a divorce eviction. I did none of those things. I knew that arguing against an anonymous compliance threat without concrete proof was a complete waste of corporate oxygen. I simply nodded, maintaining my absolute icy composure, and requested a small cardboard box. Security escorted me back to my corner office and stood by the door while I packed my personal framed photographs, my favorite fountain pen, and my leather-bound notebook. I did not rush. I packed with deliberate, measured precision. Just as I was placing the last item into the box, my cell phone rang. The screen displayed Greg's name. He must have been tracking my company's internal communications through Jamal's network, or simply watching the clock waiting for his bomb to detonate. I tapped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I just listened. Greg let out a loud, breathless laugh, sounding utterly triumphant and completely unhinged. He practically screamed into the phone, boasting about how easy it was to rip my entire professional life away from me. He gloated that he and Jamal had outsmarted me, that my prestigious career was dead, and that I was about to be investigated by federal regulators. Then his tone shifted from victorious to violently arrogant. He sneered that since I no longer had my high-paying corporate job, my precious prenuptial agreement was essentially void. Jamal had apparently fed him some absolute nonsense about material changes in financial circumstances nullifying marriage contracts. Greg confidently declared that no family court judge would enforce a contract protecting the assets of an unemployed woman accused of federal financial crimes. He told me he was currently standing in my kitchen, physically tearing the signed no-contest divorce decree into tiny pieces. He proudly announced that he and Tyler were absolutely not moving out. He commanded me to come home, drop the predatory loan liability demands, and beg for his forgiveness, promising that maybe then he would consider sending a follow-up email to clear my name. He felt like a king who had just conquered an empire. He honestly believed he had brought me to my knees. I listened to every single word of his pathetic, gloating monologue. I absorbed the sheer, staggering magnitude of his stupidity. He genuinely thought a woman whose entire existence revolves around predicting and liquidating catastrophic risks would leave herself vulnerable to a basic corporate smear campaign. I did not scream at him. I did not tell him that my suspension was merely a temporary bureaucratic formality. I did not give him a single drop of the panicked reaction he was so desperately craving. I simply lowered the phone from my ear and tapped the red button, cutting the call dead. I picked up the cardboard box, walked past the security guard, and took the private executive elevator down to the underground parking garage. I slid into the driver's seat of my sports car and placed the box on the passenger side. I started the engine, the low growl of the exhaust echoing off the concrete walls. Greg and Jamal had decided to escalate a domestic divorce into a corporate war. They had chosen to play with federal financial regulations, completely oblivious to the fact that I had been holding the ultimate trump card since the moment I left the forensic accountant's office. They wanted to see what happened when a financial risk manager lost her job. I shifted the car into drive and pulled out into the downtown traffic. It was finally time to activate the kill switch. The drive from the downtown financial district back to my suburban property was a masterclass in psychological compartmentalization. I navigated the heavy afternoon traffic with absolute mechanical precision. My hands rested lightly on the leather steering wheel of my sports car, my breathing perfectly even. A lesser woman might have been trembling with rage or paralyzed by the sheer injustice of being maliciously suspended from her own career. But I was operating on an entirely different frequency. I was no longer a wife dealing with a toxic marital dispute. I was a financial executioner carrying the digital equivalent of a nuclear payload. I turned into my neighborhood, the tree-lined streets offering a stark contrast to the absolute devastation I was about to unleash. I pulled into the driveway and parked. I grabbed the small cardboard box containing my personal office items from the passenger seat and walked up to my own front door. As I turned the key in the lock, I could hear the obnoxious booming volume of the television echoing from the living room. I stepped into the foyer and took in the scene. Greg and Tyler were sprawled carelessly across my expensive Italian leather sectional. They had raided my private pantry and my locked wine fridge. A massive spread of imported artisan cheeses, cured meats, and a highly valuable bottle of vintage Bordeaux were scattered haphazardly across the glass coffee table. Tyler had his dirty sneakers propped up directly on the glass, entirely engrossed in a video game, while stuffing his face with food he could never afford to buy himself. Greg looked up and saw me standing in the entryway holding the cardboard box. His eyes immediately lit up with a sickening, triumphant glee. He took a long, arrogant sip of my expensive wine and let out a loud, mocking bark of laughter. He actually thought the box meant I had been permanently fired and was packing up to vacate my own property. "Look who is finally home," Greg sneered, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated malice. "I told you that arrogant corporate attitude would backfire. I told you Jamal and I would break you. Since you do not have a job anymore, that bulletproof prenuptial agreement is practically toilet paper. You can put that little box down right there and start packing the rest of your bags. Tyler and I are claiming the master suite tonight." Tyler paused his video game just long enough to let out a cruel hyena-like cackle, clearly enjoying the manufactured spectacle of my supposed downfall. I did not offer them a single syllable in response. I did not blink, flinch, or show even a microscopic fraction of the panic they were so desperately trying to provoke. I simply looked right through them, rendering their entire existence as meaningless as static on a television screen. I walked straight past the living room, my heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor, completely ignoring Greg's escalating taunts as he demanded that I turn around and answer him. I walked down the hall and entered the dedicated climate-controlled network hub located adjacent to my home office. This was my personal fortress. The room hummed with the quiet, continuous power of high-capacity servers and heavy-duty encrypted routers. I stepped inside, pulled the heavy acoustic door shut, and engaged the biometric deadbolt. The obnoxious booming sounds of Greg and Tyler's premature celebration were instantly severed, leaving me in absolute perfect silence. I set my cardboard box on the floor and sat down at the primary terminal workstation. I woke up the massive dual monitors and initiated a secure, heavily encrypted virtual private network that bypassed standard commercial internet service providers. This connection was completely untraceable, designed for handling the most sensitive corporate financial data on the planet. I logged into my private secure server and accessed the deeply buried password-protected folder I had compiled with the forensic accountant just days ago. The files populated on my left monitor. I opened them one by one, conducting a final meticulous review of the devastating evidence. Exhibit A was the undeniable proof of felony identity theft. High-resolution scans of the predatory loan applications featuring my forged signature, explicitly tying Greg to $150,000 in fraudulent debt. Exhibit B was the comprehensive wire transfer log. It tracked every single stolen dollar bouncing through secondary digital wallets to mask its origin. Exhibit C was the absolute death blow for Jamal. It was the official Delaware State Corporate Registry documentation completely unmasking him as the sole registered agent and primary financial beneficiary of the Phantom Consulting Shell Company. Exhibit D contained the subsequent tax filings definitively proving massive systemic tax evasion on top of the money laundering operation. I dragged the cursor to my right monitor and opened a secure, heavily encrypted email client. It was time to systematically distribute the damage. I opened the first blank message. In the recipient line, I typed the direct secure intake address for the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes and Fraud Division. In the body of the email, I drafted a highly clinical objective summary of an ongoing interstate wire fraud and identity theft syndicate. I attached the forged loan documents, the wire logs, and the shell company registry. I did not use my name. The data spoke entirely for itself. I opened a second blank message. This one was directed to the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. There is absolutely no federal agency more aggressive and unforgiving than the IRS when they are handed concrete proof of hidden laundered income. I attached the exact same dossier, heavily highlighting the deliberate tax evasion strategies executed by Jamal's Delaware shell company. Finally, I opened a third message. This was the most personal, surgically precise strike of all. I typed in the direct corporate email address of the chief executive officer and the entire executive board of the major tech firm where Jamal currently paraded around as the arrogant, morally superior human resources director. Jamal had attempted to use his corporate position to intimidate me. He had used his knowledge of compliance protocols to fabricate a whistleblower report to suspend me from my job. Now his actual CEO was going to receive irrefutable, heavily documented proof that their highest-ranking HR executive was running a criminal money laundering syndicate out of a fake consulting firm. I sat back in my ergonomic chair and looked at the 3 drafted emails glowing on my screen. Greg and Jamal had decided to escalate a domestic dispute into an all-out war for survival. They had forced my hand, and now they were going to face the absolute maximum penalty the federal justice system could deliver. I moved my mouse to the bottom of the screen. I hovered the cursor directly over the send button. I did not hesitate. I clicked the mouse 3 times in rapid succession. The status bars flashed green across my monitor. Message sent, message sent, message sent. The massive digital payload vanished into the network, hurtling at the speed of light toward the highest federal authorities in the country. I closed the email client, locked the terminal, and stood up from my desk. The unhinged, arrogant laughter of my husband and my stepson was still vibrating faintly through the floorboards from the living room. They were drinking my wine and celebrating a victory that did not actually exist. They were completely blissfully unaware that I had just initiated an unstoppable sequence of events, and the heavy dominoes of their total destruction were officially tipped. The morning sun breached the horizon, bringing with it a wave of absolute biblical retribution. Jamal walked into the sprawling glass-enclosed lobby of his corporate headquarters at precisely 8 in the morning. He swiped his executive badge, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire career was currently ticking down its final seconds. He took the private elevator up to the Human Resources Department, carrying himself with that same unearned, suffocating arrogance he had tried to weaponize in my living room. He poured himself a cup of premium coffee, sat down at his polished mahogany desk, and prepared for another day of lecturing employees on corporate ethics. At exactly 8:15, the heavy double doors of the executive suite did not just open, they were violently breached. A coordinated task force of federal agents representing both the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division flooded the floor. They wore dark tactical windbreakers, moving with terrifying silent efficiency. They bypassed the reception desk entirely and marched straight toward Jamal's corner office. Jamal stood up, his coffee spilling onto his desk, his face contorting into a mask of pure indignation. He immediately tried to deploy his standard intimidation tactics, puffing out his chest and demanding to know who authorized this profound systemic overreach into his department. The lead federal agent did not offer a corporate rebuttal. He simply slapped a federal search and seizure warrant directly onto Jamal's chest. The warrant explicitly listed charges of interstate wire fraud, money laundering, and massive tax evasion linked to a Delaware shell company. The color completely drained from Jamal's face. His authoritative persona shattered into a million jagged pieces as an agent grabbed his arms, twisted them behind his back, and secured a pair of heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. They did not take him out through the back exit. They marched the disgraced human resources director straight down the center of the open plan office. Hundreds of his employees, the very people he had spent years intimidating and talking down to, stood up from their cubicles. They watched in absolute stunned silence as their untouchable boss walked out of the glass building, his reputation and his lucrative career instantly and permanently obliterated. While Jamal was being shoved into the back of a federal vehicle, a very different kind of resolution was unfolding across town. I was sitting at my kitchen island, calmly enjoying a fresh espresso, when my secure mobile phone rang. The caller identification displayed the direct line of the managing partner at my investment firm. I answered on the second ring, my voice perfectly level. The managing partner did not sound stern or authoritative. He sounded profoundly apologetic. He explained that immediately following my suspension, our elite internal cybersecurity team had launched a comprehensive diagnostic trace on the anonymous whistleblower report. Greg and Jamal had assumed that using a prepaid burner phone and a free encrypted email service would make them digital ghosts. But corporate cybersecurity at a multi-billion-dollar investment firm does not operate on amateur logic. The IT department easily bypassed the rudimentary encryption. They traced the specific Internet Protocol address back to a commercial cellular tower located less than 2 miles from my house. They pulled the digital metadata from the document, which still contained the hidden author tags matching Greg's registered devices. They cross-referenced the timing of the email with my physical presence in the boardroom, proving it was mathematically impossible for me to have sent or authorized it. The board of directors realized instantly that the entire report was nothing but a clumsy, malicious hoax orchestrated by a highly desperate, disgruntled, soon-to-be ex-husband. The managing partner explicitly stated that the firm recognized the severe misstep in suspending me without verifying the digital footprint first. He informed me that I was completely and unequivocally exonerated of all fabricated charges. Furthermore, he requested that I return to the downtown office, immediately arranging for a private car to be sent to my property to ensure my comfortable commute. When I stepped out of the private car and walked into the grand lobby of my firm, the atmosphere had completely shifted from the previous day. The whispers and averted gazes were entirely gone. In their place was an air of deep, palpable respect. I took the executive elevator straight up to the top floor. I was not led to my office. I was escorted directly back into the main corporate boardroom. The entire executive board, including the chief compliance officer, who had stripped me of my credentials 24 hours ago, was seated around the massive table. They all stood up the exact second I walked through the door. The managing partner delivered a formal, highly public apology on behalf of the entire corporation. He acknowledged my flawless professional record and commended my absolute stoicism in the face of such a vicious personal attack. They fully reinstated my network access, restored my security clearance, and assured me that my compensation would reflect an additional bonus for the emotional distress caused by their hasty administrative protocols. I accepted their apology with a gracious but firm nod. I did not gloat. I did not launch into a dramatic retelling of my husband's spectacular downfall. I simply thanked them for their diligent pursuit of the truth, turned around, and walked back to my corner office. I sat down in my ergonomic leather chair, unlocked my workstation, and looked out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city skyline. The storm had passed, and I had emerged entirely unscathed. I had neutralized the threats, protected my assets, and solidified my professional power. My career was secure. My wealth was protected. Now, all that was left was to handle the final pathetic remnants of the liabilities sitting in my house. I drove back to my suburban property with a private, highly specialized corporate security detail trailing directly behind my sports car. I had coordinated their extraction services immediately after leaving the executive boardroom. I was not going to personally wrangle two desperate, humiliated men out of my house. I was going to supervise a clinical, strictly enforced eviction. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of my neighborhood as I pulled into my driveway. The two heavy black SUVs belonging to the security firm parked right along the curb, blocking any potential exit. Four physically imposing security contractors stepped out, adjusting their dark suits, moving with the silent, synchronized efficiency of men who handled hostile terminations for a living. I unlocked my front door and stepped into the foyer, motioning for the detail to follow me inside. The atmosphere in the living room had shifted from arrogant celebration to absolute suffocating terror. Greg was pacing wildly behind the Italian leather sectional, clutching his smartphone with white knuckles. He was aggressively tapping the screen, his breathing ragged and shallow. He did not even notice the security team filtering into the room behind me. He was completely consumed by the catastrophic alert messages illuminating his screen. The federal investigation into Jamal's phantom consulting firm had triggered an automatic systemic freeze on every single financial node connected to the money laundering operation. Because Greg held a partial stake in the shell company and had actively funneled the forged loan capital through those exact digital pipelines, the government had acted with zero hesitation. Every single bank account holding Greg's name had been formally seized by the federal authorities. His checking account, his pathetic business account, and his digital wallets were entirely locked down, pending the ongoing criminal fraud investigation. He had absolutely zero liquidity. He could not access a single dollar to rent a cheap motel room, buy a bus ticket, or even purchase a fast food meal. He was functionally, legally, and entirely bankrupt. Greg finally looked up from his useless phone and saw me standing calmly by the entryway, flanked by four massive security contractors. The sheer reality of his total annihilation washed over his face. He opened his mouth, perhaps to beg for one last shred of mercy or to demand an explanation, but I did not give him the floor. I looked directly at the lead security contractor and gave a single firm nod. The extraction was brutal in its absolute efficiency. The security team did not entertain Greg's stammering protests. They marched straight into the living room, grabbed Greg by the arms, and forcefully guided him toward the front door. Tyler came stumbling down the mahogany staircase, carrying a cheap battered canvas duffel bag that I had legally mandated they use instead of my expensive luggage. Tyler took one look at the imposing security detail physically removing his father and began to hyperventilate. An officer pointed silently toward the open front door, indicating that the teenager had exactly 5 seconds to walk out on his own 2 feet before he was physically dragged out alongside his father. They were marched out onto the concrete walkway. The security team tossed their cheap, bulging duffel bags onto the edge of the sidewalk. The bags hit the pavement with a pathetic thud. I stepped out onto my front porch, standing at the top of the brick steps, looking down at the two men who had spent 2 years treating me like a disposable financial resource. The sudden jarring transition from living in a sprawling 5-bedroom mansion to standing completely homeless on a public curb absolutely broke Tyler's fragile, entitled psyche. The golden child, the boy who had spent his morning throwing a violent tantrum because he lost his luxury car, turned his rage entirely onto the only target left. He spun around and viciously attacked his father. Tyler screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with pure, unrestrained hatred. He cursed Greg for being a complete failure, a fraud and a pathetic loser who had ruined his entire life. He shrieked about losing his elite private school friends, his lacrosse team, and his social standing, blaming Greg for completely destroying their access to my wealth. He shoved his father hard in the chest, demanding to know where they were supposed to sleep tonight, now that Greg's bank accounts were frozen. Greg stumbled backward on the concrete, utterly defenseless against the vicious verbal assault from the very son he had spoiled rotten. The illusion of their unbreakable bond disintegrated completely into a spectacle of mutual disgust right on the public sidewalk. Before Greg could even formulate a pathetic response to his screaming son, a silver sedan sped recklessly down the street. The car slammed on its brakes, the tires screeching loudly as it jerked to a halt right next to the curb where Greg and Tyler were standing. The driver's side door flew open and Angela stumbled out. Greg's sister looked like a woman who had just survived a shipwreck. Her normally immaculate hair was a mess, her expensive makeup smeared across her cheeks from crying. She was trembling violently, clutching her designer purse to her chest like a shield. The federal raid on Jamal's corporate headquarters had triggered an immediate asset seizure for their entire household. With Jamal currently sitting in federal custody, facing severe charges of wire fraud and tax evasion, the government had locked down all of Angela's accounts. She was completely cut off from the stolen funds she had used to fund her luxurious lifestyle. Angela completely ignored her brother and her screaming nephew. She bypassed them entirely and ran straight up my front walkway, stopping at the base of the porch steps. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with sheer desperate panic. "Nicole, you have to help me!" Angela begged, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical whine. "The FBI took Jamal. They froze everything. I cannot even access my checking account to buy groceries. The bail bondsman requires a massive cash deposit to get Jamal out of federal holding, and I have absolutely nothing left. You are the only one with liquid capital. Please, we are family. You have to write me a loan. Just give me the money to fix this." I stood perfectly still on my porch, looking down at the woman who had marched into my living room just days ago, with a smug, arrogant sneer. She had actively aided in stealing my money. She had cheered while her husband threatened to destroy my career. And now she had the profound, staggering audacity to stand on my property and beg for a bailout using the exact same emotional manipulation they always relied on. I did not laugh. I did not raise my voice. I looked directly into Angela's desperate, pleading eyes. I delivered the exact words her brother had weaponized against me in the private dining room, bringing the entire toxic cycle to a hard, permanent stop. "He is not my family," I stated, my voice echoing with cold, absolute finality. "So stop trying to ask me to fix him." I turned my back on Angela's horrified face. I walked inside my beautiful, quiet house. I grasped the handle of the heavy oak front door and pulled it shut. The solid, resounding click of the deadbolt locking into place was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard, leaving them all permanently stranded on the curb to pay for their own mistakes. 6 months passed since the resounding click of that heavy oak deadbolt echoed through my foyer. The silence that subsequently settled over my sprawling 5-bedroom house was not just the mere absence of noise. It was the presence of absolute, unshakable peace. The frantic, parasitic energy that Greg and Tyler had maliciously infected my life with was completely and permanently eradicated from my property. I had spent those entire 6 months channeling every single ounce of my focus and aggression directly back into my corporate career, proving exactly why my investment firm paid me a massive salary to calculate risk and eliminate toxic liabilities. My systematic dismantling of Jamal and Greg's fraudulent shell company had not just cleared my good name. It had demonstrated a level of ruthless, unyielding competence that the executive board found entirely undeniable. Because of my flawless handling of the corporate smear campaign and my ability to navigate high-stakes financial extortion without blinking, I was officially promoted to Vice President of Risk Management. To celebrate this massive professional milestone, I invited my family out for an extravagant, uncompromising dinner. I bypassed the standard upscale restaurants and chose the absolute finest, most ultra-exclusive steakhouse located right in the heart of the downtown financial district. This was not an establishment where anyone could simply walk in and request a table. It was a dining experience where reservations took months to secure, where the ambient lighting was dim and intentionally warm, and where the heavy curved leather booths felt like private isolated sanctuaries for the city's elite. I was seated at the absolute best table in the main dining room, flanked proudly by my parents and my sister Beth. The atmosphere around our table was incredibly joyous and entirely triumphant. It was the exact perfect opposite of that disastrous, humiliating anniversary dinner half a year ago, where this entire war had started. Beth was wearing a stunning new silk dress, completely unbothered, her genuine laughter ringing clearly over the soft live jazz playing in the background. My parents were beaming with absolute pride, raising their crystal glasses of expensive imported champagne to toast my new executive title. We were celebrating my independence, my massive success, and the absolute elimination of the toxic elements that had so desperately tried to drag us down. Our heavy, dry-aged main courses had just been cleared by the meticulous busboys, and we were leisurely reviewing the leather-bound dessert menu. From my peripheral vision, I noticed a server approaching our table to refill our sparkling water. He was moving hesitantly, his footsteps uneven and unsure against the polished hardwood floor. I looked up to offer a polite standard thank you, and my eyes locked directly onto the server's face. It was Tyler, the arrogant, untouchable golden child who had once driven an $80,000 matte black luxury vehicle entirely on my dime, was now wearing a cheap, ill-fitting polyester restaurant uniform. The stark white button-down shirt was slightly wrinkled at the collar, and the standard-issue black apron hung awkwardly off his diminishing frame. He held a heavy glass pitcher of iced water tightly in his hands. As he stepped up to the edge of our leather booth, his eyes drifted upward and met mine. The blood completely vanished from his face in a fraction of a second. His eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated terror. Then he looked past me and saw Beth sitting comfortably across the table. The exact same woman whose beautiful vintage dress he had deliberately ruined, the woman he had viciously mocked and called a tasteless hick. The staggering realization of exactly whose table he was currently serving hit him like a physical, suffocating blow. Tyler started shaking. His hands trembled so violently that the ice cubes clinked loudly and frantically against the sides of the heavy glass pitcher. He tried to step backward desperately, wanting to retreat to the kitchen, but his knees bumped clumsily against the edge of the wooden booth. The heavy pitcher slipped right through his sweaty, trembling fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a violent, echoing crash. The thick glass shattered into 100 jagged pieces, sending crushed ice and freezing water splashing aggressively across the polished floor. The entire dining room went completely dead silent. Dozens of wealthy elite patrons stopped their conversations and turned their heads to stare at the clumsy, humiliated server. Tyler dropped to his knees right there in the puddle of water, his face burning a bright, frantic red. He desperately tried to scoop up the sharp shards of glass with his bare, shaking hands. He mumbled disjointed, panicked apologies, completely terrified that the restaurant manager rushing over would fire him on the spot. As I watched him scramble pathetically on the wet floor, the stark reality of his new life was entirely clear to me. I already knew the ultimate fate of the men who had ruined him. Following the massive federal investigation initiated by my data dump, the justice system had shown absolutely zero mercy. Greg had pleaded guilty to felony identity theft and wire fraud to avoid a lengthy trial. He was currently serving a rigid 3-year sentence in a state penitentiary. Jamal, the arrogant human resources director, who had masterminded the entire shell company operation, had been completely crushed by the Internal Revenue Service. He was facing a severe 5-year federal sentence for money laundering and massive tax evasion. Angela had completely vanished from the city, bankrupted and deeply humiliated by her husband's highly publicized criminal downfall. Tyler looked up at me from the floor, his eyes completely filled with panicked, humiliating tears. He braced himself for me to mock him. He fully expected me to laugh in his face, to point a finger at him, or to demand that his manager terminate his employment right in front of the entire crowded restaurant. He expected me to deliver the exact same brand of vicious public cruelty he had inflicted on my sister 6 months ago. I did absolutely nothing. I did not smile. I did not smirk. I did not offer a single word of recognition or acknowledge his pathetic existence in any capacity. I simply shifted my gaze back to the leather dessert menu and calmly asked Beth if she preferred the chocolate souffle or the vanilla bean creme brulee. I rendered him entirely profoundly insignificant. He was no longer a threat, an enemy, or even a distant memory. He was just a random, incompetent waiter who had dropped a glass. The absolute impenetrable indifference was the most lethal, devastating response I could have possibly delivered. Another server quickly rushed over with a towel to sweep up the mess, apologizing profusely and ushering a thoroughly broken, trembling Tyler away toward the swinging kitchen doors. We finished our decadent desserts in perfect harmony, completely unbothered by the minor interruption. When the extravagant bill finally arrived, the total was astronomical, reflecting the premium wine, the prime cuts of meat, and the flawless atmosphere. I pulled out my heavy metal corporate card and paid the entire balance without a second thought. I signed the receipt with a smooth, decisive stroke of my pen. I pulled a crisp, perfectly unwrinkled $100 bill from my leather wallet and placed it deliberately on the silver tray. Then, using my pen, I wrote a very short, very clear note on the back of the customer receipt. Learn to pay your own bills. I stood up, adjusting my tailored charcoal blazer, and walked out of the exclusive restaurant alongside my family. The cool night air of the city hit my face, crisp and incredibly refreshing. The valet rushed forward and pulled my brand new, heavily customized Porsche up to the curb, the sleek metallic paint gleaming perfectly under the golden streetlights. I hugged my parents and my sister, saying our warm, joyous goodbyes on the sidewalk. I slid into the driver's seat, the powerful engine roaring to life with a deep, satisfying hum. I shifted the sports car into gear and pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the vibrant, illuminated downtown traffic. I was 31 years old, sitting at the absolute pinnacle of my career, completely in control of my massive wealth, and entirely untouchable. The most profound lesson to extract from this story is the undeniable power of financial independence, coupled with impenetrable personal boundaries. Often toxic individuals rely on societal expectations of family loyalty to manipulate, extort, and abuse those around them. They exploit empathy and weaponize guilt, assuming their victims will endlessly tolerate disrespect just to keep the peace. However, as this narrative brilliantly demonstrates, true peace is not achieved by catering to abusers. It is achieved by cutting them off completely. When you maintain absolute control over your own resources, whether emotional, legal, or financial, you hold the ultimate leverage over your own life. The protagonist did not resort to screaming, crying, or begging for basic respect, which are exactly the chaotic emotional reactions that manipulative people feed on. Instead, she responded with clinical detachment and swift, decisive action. By neutralizing the financial life support that funded her abuser's arrogance, she exposed their underlying weakness, entitlement, and cowardice. This story teaches us that we are under absolutely no obligation to subsidize our own disrespect. Marriage certificates and blood relations do not grant anyone a free pass to inflict cruelty or commit fraud. True strength lies in recognizing your own worth, insulating yourself from parasitic relationships, and having the courage to close the heavy door on anyone who refuses to treat you with basic human decency. You alone are the architect of your own peace. What is the most difficult boundary you have ever had to set with a toxic person, and how did it change your life? Please share your experiences and comment below.